The thing at the tree line did not move, and that was the part that made Warden Otku's hands shake. He had watched predators before. All his long life on Tellin Reach he had watched them, the marsh stalkers that ran their prey to exhaustion, the skyhooks that folded out of the clouds, the pale burrowers that took a grazer down through the soil so fast the herd never heard it scream. Predators moved. That was the whole grammar of them. You read the twitch, the crouch, the shift of weight, and you knew when to run. A predator that moved could be understood. The thing standing in the gray mist at the edge of the quiet wood had not moved in 11 minutes. Otku crouched behind the rock spine with the two young scouts and counted his own breathing to keep it slow. Below them, across a shallow apron of bracken, the wood began, a black wall of trunks so old the Thren had no word for their age, only a word for the silence that came out of them. The mist there never fully burned off, not even under the two suns at noon, and in that mist, 40 strides out from the first trees, stood the shape. It was enormous. Low and long and heavy through the shoulders, its head carried level, its pale forelegs planted in the wet moss like the roots of something. Its coat was the color of old ash, dark across the back, going to gray-white down the legs and around the broad, blunt muzzle. Its eyes were open. It was looking directly up the slope at the three of them, and it had chosen not to hide the fact. "Warden," whispered the younger scout Tavi, and Otku heard the boy's throat click dry. "Warden, it sees us." "It has seen us since we came over the ridge," Otku said quietly. "Do not stand. Do not turn your back to it. We go down the way we came, slow, and we do not stop until the rock is between us." "It hasn't crossed the line," said the other scout, Ren, older, steadier, but even her voice had gone thin. "Warden, it's right there. Why hasn't it crossed the line?" That Otku did not answer, because the true answer was the oldest law of his people and the most shameful, and it was this. In 300 years, the thing in the wood had never once crossed its own tree line to hunt them. Not once. Everything the quiet wood took, it took inside. Wander past the trees and you went quiet forever. Stay on the grass, on the open ground in the light, and it watched you, and it let you go. The Thren had built their whole survival on that single mercy they did not understand, and they had never dared ask why the mercy held. The shape's head turned, tracking them, as the three Thren backed down the slope. It did not follow. When the rock spine finally cut it from view, Otku realized his knees had locked. "It's a guardian," Ren said when they were down among the low stones and could stand. She said it the way you'd confess something. "The old stories, it stands guard. It doesn't hunt us because we're not what it's guarding against." "The old stories say a great many things," Otku said. "Walk." But he had thought it too. He had thought it for 40 years. They had lost a child to the wood 4 days ago. That was why the three of them were up on the ridge at all, why Otku had brought scouts to a place every sane Thren avoided. The child was a settlement girl named Syl, 9 seasons old, who had chased a wind toy past the boundary stones her mother had told her never to pass, and had not come back. Search parties went to the tree line and no farther. No Thren in living memory had gone farther and returned. They had stood at the edge and called her name into the black trunks until their voices gave out, and the wood had given them nothing back but its silence. And now the settlements below were not frightened anymore. They were angry. Grief had curdled into something with a jaw. When Otku came down off the ridge that evening, the anger had a name, and the name had come in on the noon shuttle from the provincial seat, wearing the gray andiron of the reclamation office. Her name was Marshal Decor, and she was Dravith, which meant she stood a full head above any Thren in the room, and was built like a thing designed to end arguments. She had set up in the settlement hall as if she owned it, spread survey maps across 3 tables, and by the time Otku arrived, she had already said the word that every Thren in the valley had wanted to say for 300 years, and never had the strength to. "Burn it," Marshal Decor said. The hall went very still. "Put a fire line along the western ridge," she went on, tapping the map with one broad gray finger, not looking up. "We seed accelerant from the air. We take the whole massif in a single burn while the season's dry. 40 days of clean fire and this." She gestured at the dark shape of the wood on the map, drawn by some long-dead cartographer as a scribble of thorns with a single eye in the middle of it. "This superstition is ash, and your children stop dying, and Tellen Reach joins the modern century. I have done 9 of these. I have never lost one to a burn." "You have never burned this one," Otku said. Every head turned. He had not meant to speak. He was old, and he was only a marchwarden, a keeper of boundary stones and taboos, the lowest rung of authority that still had a title. But he had spent 40 years at the edge of that wood, and he could not sit in a warm hall and listen to a Dravith marshal call it a scribble. Decor looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were the flat orange of a banked coal. "And you are?" "Otku, marchwarden of the Tellen boundary." "The one who keeps people out." "The one who keeps people alive," he said, "which is the same job here and has been for 300 years. By telling them a monster lives in the trees and they may not go and look." Decor straightened, and the room seemed to lose a little of its light behind her. "Do you know what I see when I look at your valley, Marchwarden? I see a people who have agreed, generation after generation, to be smaller than they are, who fenced off 1/3 of their best land and taught their children to be afraid of a shadow because once, long ago, something frightening lived in it. That is not survival, that is a slow surrender." She swept the survey drone stills across the table toward him, grainy long-range images, all of them because no camera had ever gotten close and come back with its operator. "I am here to end the surrender. The burn is authorized. It begins in 12 days. "You have a picture of it," Otku said. He picked up the nearest still. The ash-gray shape stood in the mist at the tree line, 4 legs planted, head level, looking straight into the lens with those open, unhurried eyes. Even flat and gray and stolen from a mile away, the image made the back of his neck crawl. "You have looked at it. And you think it is a shadow." "I think," said Decor, "that it is an animal, a large, old, territorial animal, and animals burn." "Then answer the Marchwarden's question," said a new voice from the doorway. "Why hasn't it crossed the line?" The voice was strange, flatter than a Thren voice, without the double tone, the vowels laid down plain and even. Every head in the hall turned again, and this time the stillness that fell was of an entirely different kind, because the person in the doorway was a human, and no human had set foot in the Tellen Valley in living memory either. She was small. That was the first thing Otku registered, and it surprised him. He had met humans before at the provincial seat, and they were not usually small among their own kind, but this one was slight, narrow through the shoulders, barely up to a Thren's chin. Young, he thought, though he read human faces poorly. There was an unfinished quickness to her, a way of standing that had not yet learned to armor itself. Plain gray work clothes, a canvas satchel worn shiny at the strap, a cataloger's lamp still clipped to her collar, dust on her knees. She looked like exactly what the little brass plate on the archive door said she was. The junior records officer of the Joint Liaison Post, the one human posted to a valley that had forgotten humans existed, whose entire job was to sort 3 centuries of unopened crates that nobody had ever thought were worth reading. Her name was Ren Halloran, and she was holding a book. "Sorry," Ren said into the silence, not sounding especially sorry. "The door was open and I heard the word burn, and I ran the whole way from the archive, so give me a second." She put one hand on the doorframe and breathed. Then she looked up, found Decor, found the map, found the scribble with the eye in it. Something moved across her small, plain face, not fear, recognition. "You want to burn the quiet wood." "This is a settlement matter," Decor said. "The human liaison has no." 311 years, Ren said. Decor stopped. "That's how long it's been standing at that tree line and not crossing it," Ren went on, walking into the hall now, and Otku noticed she walked to the map, not to the marshal. She had already decided who in the room mattered, and it wasn't the biggest one. "You asked why it hasn't crossed the line. 311 years, and it has never once come out of the trees to take a thren on open ground. You've all built your lives around that fact, and none of you ever asked what kind of animal does that. She set her book down on the map, right over the scribble, and it was not a book at all, Otku saw now, but a field log, cracked leather, its pages swollen with age and damp and redrying. A human ledger so old the ink had gone the brown of dried blood. I asked. I spent 4 months in the crates asking, and I think I finally know what's in your wood. Records officer, Decor said, with the patience of someone deciding whether to be amused. What is in the wood? Ren Halloran opened the old log to a page she had marked with a strip of gray cloth and turned it around so the room could see. The thren nearest her flinched back from it. It was a photograph, a real chemical photograph, the kind humans had stopped making centuries ago, faded to sepia and silver. It showed a rough camp under a pale double sun, prefab domes and a stock pen and a line of small human figures squinting at the camera. And in the front of the line, sitting, its great pale forelegs planted and its blunt head carried level, its eyes open and calm and looking straight into the lens across 300 years, was the thing from the tree line. The hall made a sound, not a word, just a long, low, collective intake of breath, the sound of 100 people's certainties coming loose at once. It's a dog, Ren said quietly. It's not a monster, it's a dog. And it's been up there on that ridge for 300 years, doing the only job anybody ever gave it. Nobody spoke. Outside, the wind came down off the massif and moved through the boundary stones with the sound it always made, the sound the Thren had taught their children to fear. And for the first time in 300 years, there was a person in the valley who heard that sound and did not feel afraid at all. She felt late. That was the thing she couldn't say out loud in a room full of grieving strangers. She looked at the calm animal in the photograph, guarding a camp of people who were all 3 centuries dead, and what Ren Halloran felt, standing in that hall, was a terrible and specific grief on behalf of an animal that had been waiting at a post nobody remembered assigning it. "Where did you get that?" Decor said. It was not a question anymore. "Crate 41, said Ren. "Bottom of the archive behind the climate units under a tarp somebody threw over it about 200 years ago and never lifted again. It's the survey log of the Cassin expedition. Human, pre-accord. First and only human landing on this world before formal contact 311 years ago, and then," she turned a page gently as if the paper might bruise, "and then nothing. No evac record, no casualty list filed, no follow-up. They just fall out of the record, like somebody closed a door on them and walked away. 41 people and their working animals, and the last legible entry in this log is a single line." "Read it," Otku said. He did not know he was going to speak until he had. Ren looked at him. Something passed between the old Thren warden who had spent 40 years keeping people away from the wood, and the young human who had spent 4 months learning why the wood had spent 300 years keeping something for them. Then she found the line with one finger, and she read it aloud in the flat, plain human voice, and the hall was so silent that the wind at the stones sounded like breathing. "If we do not come back for them," Ren read, "the dogs will hold. That is what they are. They will hold the line until we relieve them. God help me, they will hold it forever if we let them." She closed the log. "Nobody ever relieved them," she said. "Nobody ever came back. That animal on your ridge is the last of a line that has been holding a perimeter around 41 graves for 311 years, because the last order it was ever given was to hold, and no human ever came to tell it that it could stop." She picked up the log and held it against her chest like something that could be cold. "So no, you're not going to burn it. I'm going to go up there and I'm going to relieve the post." Decor laughed, a short, hard, disbelieving bark of a laugh. "You're going to walk into the wood that has killed everything that entered it for 300 years. "Everything that entered it meaning to do harm," Ren said. "That's a different sentence. You should learn to hear the difference. It's going to matter to you in about 12 days. She was already turning for the door. "I'll need a day to read the rest of the log, Marshal, I take that as a professional courtesy, one day before you seed a mountain with fire. If I'm wrong, you've lost a day. If I'm right, you were about to burn a war memorial with the last honor guard still standing at it. And she walked out into the wind, a small plain human carrying a dead expedition's last words, leaving a hall full of aliens staring at a photograph of the monster they had feared for 3 centuries, sitting patiently in the sun, waiting for its people to come home. Otku looked down at the survey still in his own hand, the ash-gray shape at the tree line, the level head, the open eyes. He had spent 40 years reading that gaze as the patience of a thing, deciding whether to kill you. He wondered, for the first time, whether he had been reading it exactly backward, whether the patience in those eyes was not a hunter's at all, but something far older and far more terrible to have gotten wrong for 300 years, the patience of a soldier at a post, watching the wrong horizon, waiting for the one face that would tell it the war was over. Outside, past the boundary stones, up on the gray ridge, the last dog of the Cassin expedition lay down in the moss at the edge of its wood, put its blunt head on its pale forepaws, and went on holding the line. The archive was a converted grain store on the low edge of the settlement, and Wren had made a nest of it in the 4 months she'd been posted here. A lamp, a cot she wasn't supposed to sleep on, a wall where she'd pinned everything she could reconstruct of 41 people nobody else had bothered to mourn. She did not expect the knock. Otku had to fold himself nearly double to come through the human-height door, and he stood among the crates the way large, careful people stand in rooms full of breakable things, all elbows tucked in. He looked at the wall of pinned notes and photographs, and the crate marked 41, still open, its lid leaning against the climate unit where she'd left it. "You came alone," he said. "So did you." Wren pulled the second stool out with her foot. "Sit before you break your back. You're the warden, the old one. You asked me to read the line." "Otku," he sat, and the stool complained. "I have kept people away from that wood for 40 years, records officer. My father did it before me, and his mother before him. It is the only thing my family has ever been. And in one evening a human I have never met walks into the hall and tells me the thing I have feared my whole life is a—" He stopped, as if the word were still too strange to trust in his mouth, "a domestic animal." "A working animal," Wren said. "There's a difference, and the difference is the whole story. May I show you?" He nodded, so she showed him. She had spent 4 months in crate 41, and she laid it out for the alien warden the way she had assembled it for herself, in the order the log gave it up, because that was the only order that made the grief bearable. The Cassin expedition had been 41 people: botanists, a geologist, 2 medics, a soil chemist, a comms officer, families, a cook. Pre-accord, before treaties, before anyone knew the Thren existed. They had come to survey a green world at the edge of the surveyed dark, and they had brought, because you did on a frontier world with grazing stock and predators you couldn't predict, 6 livestock guardian dogs. "Not hunting dogs," Wren said. "That's what everyone gets wrong when I say dog, guardian dogs. There's an old breed of them from a dry part of Earth, big, slow, patient, bred for 6,000 years to do exactly one thing." She turned the log to a handler's page, a woman's cramped, diligent writing. "You put them out with the flock and you leave. No fences, no commands most days. The dog decides the edge of what's his and he holds it, and nothing, wolf, bear, cat, stranger, nothing crosses that edge while he's standing. They don't chase. Chasing is a hunter's mistake. It takes the guardian off his ground. They hold. A good one will stand between the flock and a bear all night and never take a step forward, and in the morning the bear is gone and the sheep never even woke up." She looked at the survey still, at the ash-gray shape planted at the tree line. "They picked the most stubborn animal that has ever lived on Earth to guard the far edge of the galaxy, and then they died." "How?" Otku said. "A blight." Wren pulled a medic's page, water-stained, the writing deteriorating down it like the writer had. Something in the local soil the chemist missed. It got into the water table and then into the people slow over a season. By the time they understood it, half of them were too sick to work the comms array, and the array needed line power, and the line power came from the stock they were too sick to tend. And it all comes apart in about 40 days in this book, Warden. 40 days. They died in the domes, most of them. The handler's last full entry, she found it, says they carried the ones who'd passed up to a clearing above the camp, up in the trees where the ground was soft, and buried them there, and set the dogs to watch the graves because the scavengers were coming down out of the hills by then, and nobody had the strength to keep them off with a rifle. Otku was very still. Outside, the two suns were going down behind the massif, and the light in the grain store had gone the color of the old log's pages. The last 3 entries are 1 line each, Ren said. The first says the comms officer thinks he's raised a passing ship and they might get an evac window. The second says the window's real, a Thren trade vessel, first contact, the officer weeping with relief in the margins. And the third, the last legible thing anyone wrote on this world in a human hand for 300 years, is the one I read in the hall. She didn't need the page for it, she had it by heart. If we do not come back for them, the dogs will hold. That is what they are. They will hold the line until we relieve them. The evac came, Otku said slowly. That is our record. 300 years ago, a Thren vessel took survivors off a plague world at the edge of the trade dark. 9 survivors. It is a small footnote in our history. The first humans we ever met, sick and dying, we took them off and we quarantined the world and we never spoke of it again because, he stopped. Because a plague world is a cursed world, Ren said gently, and you don't go back to a cursed world. You put a beacon on it and you forget it and you tell your children the mountain is haunted. 9 people got off. 32 are still up there in that clearing, and 6 dogs watched the ship leave. The warden closed his eyes. When a Thren closes his eyes fully in front of another person, it is not a small thing. Ren had learned that much in 4 months. It is the gesture of a creature admitting it cannot bear to keep looking. We settled the valley 80 years later, he said, when the beacon's warning had faded and the soil had cleaned itself, and there was already a thing in the wood by then, already the stories, already the law do not pass the trees. We thought, he opened his eyes, we thought we had found the monster the humans died running from. We built 300 years of fear on top of 32 graves, and never once understood that the thing we feared was standing guard over the very people we told ourselves it had killed. Its grandparents were, Ren said. That animal up there now is maybe the 10th of its line. Guardian dogs live 12, 13 years. So somewhere in those 300 years, 6 dogs became a pack, and a pack became a line, and every generation the old ones taught the young ones the edge of the ground, and the job, and the one thing they were never told they could stop doing. She rubbed her face with both hands, and for a moment she looked exactly as young as she was. They've been raising replacements, Warden, for 300 years. Standing a post in shifts across 10 generations because nobody ever came back to say relieved. That's what's in your wood, not a monster. The most loyal thing Earth ever made, still at its post, still holding. 300 years after the last person who could give it an order died in a dome at the bottom of the hill. The wind moved through the boundary stones outside, that long low note, and this time Otku heard it the way Ren had heard it in the hall, not as a warning, but as a thing that had been calling a name into the trees for 300 years and getting no answer. You mean to go up there, he said. Tomorrow. At first light on the open ground in full sight slow. She was already sorting a small pack water, the log, a folded blanket, nothing that looked like a weapon because that was the entire point. I'm not going to walk into the trees. I'm not stupid, and I'm not owed anything by an animal that's never met me. I'm going to go up onto the open moss below the tree line where it can see me the whole way, and I'm going to sit down at the edge of its ground. And I'm going to open this log, and I'm going to read to it. Read to it. The handler's pages, their words, Their voices as close as I can get. Guardian dogs know the sound of their handlers before they know anything else. It's the first sound in their lives and the last. She looked up at him. 300 years is a long time, Warden. I don't think that dog remembers a human. I don't think there's a memory left to jog. But the shape of the thing might still be in there. The cadence, the low, steady handler voice, the sound a person makes when they're not afraid of you and they want you to hold. 6,000 years of breeding put that sound so deep in these animals it might as well be in the marrow. I'm going to make that sound at the edge of its ground until it decides what I am. She zipped the pack. Either it knows the sound or it doesn't. If it doesn't, I stay on the open ground and I come home and Decor gets her burn and I was wrong. But I'm not going to let anyone put fire to that mountain until somebody has at least gone up there and said thank you in a voice it might recognize. Somebody owes it that. Somebody has owed it that for 300 years. Otku looked at the small human for a long moment. Then he stood, unfolding toward the low ceiling. Then I will stand on the ridge behind you, he said. Not to protect you. I could not protect you from that animal if it decided otherwise, and we both know it. But if the last of the Cassin line is going to be relieved of its post tomorrow, after 300 years, then a warden of this valley should be there to witness it. It is the only apology my people have to give. Ren almost said something. Instead she just nodded, and that was better. The next morning the light came gray and even off the massif, the mist lying in the folds of the wood like something breathing in its sleep. And Ren Halloran walked up out of the settlement toward the tree line with a dead expedition's log against her chest and a folded blanket under her arm. And behind her, on the rock spine, stood an old alien warden, and, she noted with some private amusement, about 40 other Thren who had absolutely been told to stay in the settlement. They came because they could not come. That was the thing about a fear you've carried for 300 years. When someone finally walks toward it, you find you have to watch. They lined the rock spine and the low stones, silent, hundreds of eyes, and among them, arms folded, unreadable, stood Marshal Decor, who had given Ren her one day and clearly intended to spend all of it being proven right. Ren did not look back at them. She had learned, somewhere in 4 months alone with the dead, that an audience was just weather. You could not manage it, so you ignored it. She kept her eyes on the tree line and on the ash-gray shape that had risen out of the moss the moment she cleared the boundary stones, and stood now at the edge of the trees, 4 legs planted, head level, watching her come. It was so much bigger up close. The survey stills had not prepared her for the mass of it. It stood as high at the shoulder as a small pony and half again as broad, a wall of ash and gray muscle under a weather-matted coat, its head as wide as her whole torso, its jaws. She made herself not think about the jaws. Its eyes were dark and deep-set and utterly, terribly calm, and they were fixed on her. And as she came up the last of the slope onto the open moss below the tree line, the great head turned to keep her in them, tracking her the way the survey stills had caught it tracking the scouts, with that awful unhurried patience. She stopped at the edge of its ground. She knew where the edge was because the dog told her, a subtle thing, a lift of the head, a shift of weight onto the forelegs, the ancient grammar of a guardian saying this far. 20 strides out. She stopped at 25. Okay, Ren said softly to it and to herself. Okay, good, that's your line, I see it. I'm not going to cross it. The dog did not move. She lowered herself to the moss, slow, keeping her hands where the animal could see them, and she spread the blanket, and she sat, cross-legged, small, unarmored, 25 strides from 300 pounds of guardian that had killed everything that ever came at it meaning harm. On the rock spine behind her, 400 meters back, she heard the Thren make their soft collective sound of horror. She ignored it. She took the log out of her satchel and opened it across her knees to the handler's first page, and she found the woman's careful, diligent writing. And in the gray, even morning light at the edge of the quiet wood, Ren Halloran began, quietly and without fear, to read aloud to the last soldier of a war 3 centuries over. Day 1, she read. Offloaded the stock and the dogs at dawn. The big male took one look at the tree line and would not be moved from it. Handler's instinct says let him choose his ground. He's chosen. He's decided the trees are the edge of the world and everything behind him is his to keep. Good boy. Named him Ash for the color of him. Ash it is. The dog's head came up. Not far, a finger's width. A tightening of attention across 300 years and 10 generations. At the sound of a name that no living thing had spoken aloud within a mile of that tree line, since the last handler died coughing in a dome at the bottom of the hill. Wren felt it happen. She did not look up. Looking up would have been a challenge, and she knew better, but she felt the quality of the animal's attention change, the way you feel a room go quiet behind you. She kept her voice exactly level. She kept reading. He knows his name, she read on from a later page, a different day, the same handler's hand. 3 days and he knows it. Won't come when I call, guardians don't come, they're not that kind of dog, but the ears go every time. Ash, like I've handed him something. Like it settles him to be spoken to by name out here at the edge of nowhere, this far from everything he was ever bred to guard. And 25 strides away, at the edge of its ground, in the gray morning light, the last dog of the Cassin expedition took one slow step forward onto the open moss. The first step across its own tree line, toward a human, in 311 years, and lay down. Not crouched, not coiled, lay down. Chin on its pale forepaws, ash-gray bulk settling into the wet moss with a long breath that Wren felt more than heard, dark eyes still on her, but soft now. The whole enormous shape of it going loose and heavy and quiet the way a working animal goes, quiet only when it has decided, in the deep certain place beneath thought, that the thing in front of it is not a threat but a relief. Behind her, on the rock spine, 400 Thren and 1 Dravith marshal watched the monster of the quiet wood lie down in the open like a dog at a hearth, and not one of them made a sound, because there was no sound in any of their languages for what they were seeing. Wren Halloran turned a page and kept reading, and did not let them see her cry. She read for 2 hours. When the light climbed high enough to burn the mist off the lower slopes, the dog was still lying in the open moss, chin on its paws, and Wren's voice had gone hoarse, and she closed the log and said, in the same low, even handler voice she'd used the whole time, "That's all I've got for today, Ash. I'll come back. I promise I'll come back." And she gathered her blanket and stood slow and walked backward down the slope until the rock was between them, and only then did she let her legs shake. Otku caught her arm. He had come down off the spine. His gray face had a stunned looseness to it, the look of a man whose foundations have shifted in the night. "It lay down," he said, "in the open, in front of 400 of us. It has never, records officer, in 300 years it has never once." "Its name is Ash," Wren said. Her voice cracked on it. "Sorry, I need a minute. Its name is Ash and nobody has said its name for 300 years and I need a minute." She got her minute. She did not get much more, because Marshal Decor was already coming down off the spine with the unhurried heaviness of someone who has watched a miracle and filed it under complications. "That was well done," Decor said, and to her credit she said it plainly, no sneer in it. "I have handled animals. That was very well done. You read the ground, you read the animal, you never crossed its line, and you got a 300-year-old territorial guardian to stand down and lie in the open. I have never seen its equal, and I have been doing this a long time." She stopped in front of Wren, and the coal-orange eyes were not unkind, and that was somehow worse. "And the burn goes ahead in 11 days. Wren stared at her. "You just watched." "I watched an animal that has killed everything that entered its ground for 3 centuries decide, on the strength of a name and a voice, that one specific small human is not prey." Decor folded her arms. "Do you understand what you have actually shown me, records officer? You have shown me that the thing in the wood is not a mindless territorial beast that we can predict and manage. You have shown me it is loyal. It is intelligent enough to recognize, to choose, to bond." An animal that's stupid we could fence around forever. An animal that can choose is an animal that can change its mind about the edge of its ground the day something it loves is threatened, and now something it loves is a human standing in my valley. She let that land. I am not in the business of leaving a 300-pound guardian on a hillside above a settlement of children. I am in the business of removing threats. You have made this animal more of one, not less. That's insane, Wren said. It's the most restrained animal that has ever lived. It held its line for 3 centuries. It has never once had a reason to cross, Decor said. You just gave it one. You gave it something to protect on this side of the trees. Congratulations. You have turned a static hazard into a mobile one. She turned to go. 11 days. I would spend them saying your goodbyes to it, records officer, in whatever voice it likes. When the fire line goes in, I will need you and every civilian off that slope. Do not make me carry you. She walked away up the slope toward the settlement, gray and iron and certain. And Wren stood there with the log against her chest and understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, that she had been so busy being right about what the dog was that she had never once stopped to consider that being right might not be enough. She is not wrong, Otku said quietly beside her. That is the terrible part. By her lights she is not wrong. A loyal thing is more dangerous than a mindless one to anyone standing on the wrong side of the loyalty. She has decided her people stand on the wrong side. She will burn a mountain to be sure of it. Then I have 11 days to put her on the right side of it, Wren said. She did not yet know how, but she had learned something in 4 months alone with 41 dead people, and it was this: the truth was not a thing you announced. It was a thing you walked people all the way up to slowly, on open ground, until they could not unsee it. She had gotten a 300-year-old guardian to lie down in the moss. She would find a way to make a Dravith marshal do the same. She just needed something the marshal could not file under complications. She needed something no one could look at and choose the fire anyway. She got it that night, and it came in the shape of the thing she had not let herself think about. Syl's mother came to the archive after dark. Her name was Danu, and she was young for a Thren to have lost a child, and she stood in the door of the grain store with her hands knotted in front of her and her eyes the raw pink of an alien who has not slept in 4 days, and she said, "You went up. You sat with it. You went closer than anyone has ever." She stopped, started again. "My daughter is Syl. She went into the wood 5 days ago. Everyone has told me she is dead. The warden has told me kindly that she is dead. The marshal has told me she is why the wood must burn." Danu's voice did not break, which was worse than breaking. "You are the only person on this world who has looked at that animal and not seen a killer, so I am going to ask you the question no one else will let me ask. That thing has never crossed its line to hurt us. It only ever hurts what comes at it, meaning harm." She took a step into the lamplight. "My daughter is 9 years old and she was chasing a toy. What harm is a 9-year-old chasing a toy? Records officer, is my daughter dead in that wood, or is she being held in it?" Wren felt the floor of the world tilt. She had read the whole log. She had read the handler's pages about the graves, the clearing, the soft ground up in the trees where they carried their dead. She had read 6,000 years of guardian breeding in her own species' history. The dogs that pulled drowning children out of rivers, that lay across babies in blizzards, that had exactly one instinct beneath the guarding one, and it was the oldest instinct any working animal carried, and the reason humans had trusted them with the flock in the first place. Guardians did not only keep the wolf out, they kept the lamb in. A guardian that finds a small helpless thing wandering loose in its territory does not consider it prey. It considers it stock. It rounds it, and it beds it down where the ground is safe, and it stands over it, and it holds. "I don't know," Wren said, because she would not lie to this woman. "I don't know, Danu. But I know exactly what kind of animal that is, and I know that a guardian dog does not hurt a child, and I know that if a child wandered into that wood and lay down and cried, that animal would not eat her. She was already reaching for her pack. It would guard her. It would put her somewhere safe, and it would stand over her, and it would keep everything in the world off her until somebody came. That's not a guess. That is the single thing that Breed does not get wrong. Then she could be. She could be alive. Wren said it fast before Hope could make either of them stupid. 5 days. It's cold up there at night, and she's 9, and I don't know what she's had to eat. And I am not going to promise you a living daughter, Danu, because I would rather cut my own tongue out than promise you that and be wrong. But I know what's in that wood now. And tomorrow at first light I am going to walk up to Ash, and I am going to read to him until he trusts me enough to let me pass the line, and then I am going to go into the trees and find out. She met the alien mother's raw pink eyes. And if your daughter is up there, I am going to bring her down, on the open ground, in full sight, where the marshal and the whole valley can watch the monster of the quiet wood hand a child back to her mother. She heard her own voice go hard and level. Let her file that under complications. Danu made a sound then, a thren sound Wren had no name for, and put both her knotted hands over her face. And Wren did the only thing she could think to do, which was to stand and let the alien mother grip her shoulder hard enough to bruise, in the lamplight, over a crate of the dead, both of them betting everything they had left on the good sense of a dog. Word of it went through the settlement before dawn the way only that kind of word travels. By the time Wren came up out of the valley the next morning, the rock spine was not lined with the merely curious. It was lined with the whole settlement, and they were not silent this time. There was a low, continuous murmur off them, the sound of a crowd that has been handed a hope it does not know whether it is allowed to hold. Danu stood at the front of the spine with 2 older Thren holding her upright. And off to the side, apart, arms folded, stood Marshal Decor, who had heard the word too, and who had come to watch the humans' dangerous new complication get a child killed on open ground, so that no one could ever again argue against the fire. Otku met Wren at the boundary stones. The whole valley is here. I noticed. If you are wrong. If I'm wrong, a mother watches me come out of those trees carrying nothing, and Decor wins forever, and I have to live with it. Wren shifted the log against her chest. I know the math, Warden. I did it all night. I'm going up anyway. Some math you do, and then you go up anyway. She cleared the boundary stones, and up on the open moss below the tree line the ash-gray shape rose out of the ground to meet her, and this time, it did not stop at its own line. Ash came 3 strides out onto the open moss toward her, head level, tail carried low and still, and stopped, and waited, and Wren understood that overnight, in whatever way 300 years of held instinct did its accounting, the dog had moved her from the category of thing approaching to the category of thing belonging, and she had to stop and breathe for a second before her legs would carry her the rest of the way. She sat where she'd sat the day before. She opened the log, but she didn't read the handler's pages this time. She looked up directly, gently, a soft look, not a challenge, into the deep, dark, calm eyes of the last dog of the Cassin expedition, 20 strides away, and she said in the low, even voice, the handler's voice, the voice 6,000 years deep, "Ash, good boy, I need you to do something you haven't done in a long time." She closed the log and set it aside on the blanket. "I need you to let me come past the line. I need you to show me the clearing. I know there's a clearing. I've read about it. I know what you've been holding up there." Her voice wanted to shake, and she would not let it. "And I think you might be holding one more thing than the graves right now. A little one. A live one. And I need you to take me to her, Ash. I need you to take me to the little one." For a long moment the dog only looked at her, and the whole valley held its breath on the rock spine behind her, and the mist moved in the trees. Then Ash stood and turned and walked 3 slow steps back toward the tree line and stopped and looked over his great ash-gray shoulder at her, plainly and unmistakably, the way a working dog looks back at a handler it wants to follow it. And Wren Halloran got to her feet, left the log and the blanket lying in the open moss where 400 aliens could see them, and walked into the quiet wood, the first person to cross that tree line and mean it in 311 years. following a monster that had turned out to be the best and most patient thing her whole species had ever made. Behind her, the trees closed over the light, and the valley lost sight of her, and on the rock spine Martial Decor unfolded her arms very slowly, because in 9 burns across 9 worlds she had never once, not one single time, watched a small, unarmed thing walk into a killing ground on the strength of nothing but knowing what an animal was, and some cold certain thing in the Marshal's chest, some load-bearing wall of her whole hard career, had begun, very quietly, to crack. The wood was not what 300 years of fear had made of it. Wren had braced for a place that felt like a throat. What she found, once the trees closed the light down to a green underwater dusk, was old forest, enormous smooth-barked trunks rising branchless for the height of a building before they spread, a deep soft floor of centuries of fallen needles, the air cool and resinous and absolutely still. No undergrowth to speak of. The canopy took all the light. It felt less like a monster's den than like the inside of something built for reverence, a hall with a roof too high to see. It felt, she thought, and then made herself stop thinking, like a place that had been kept. Ash walked ahead of her at a working pace, never hurrying, never looking back more than every dozen strides to confirm she followed. And she was not, she realized within the first 100 meters, alone with him. They came out of the trees the way the mist did without seeming to arrive. She caught the first one at the edge of her vision, a shape the gray of wet bark, pacing her 30 strides off to the left, matching her stride for stride. Then another, right, younger and leaner, its coat more brindle than ash. Then 2 more behind, keeping the distance a good guardian keeps, never closing, never falling back. 5 of them, then 7. Then she stopped counting because counting was making her afraid, and fear was the one thing she could not afford to carry into that wood. The pack, the line. 10 generations of the Cassin dogs, ranging in size and coat and age from the great gray patriarch ahead of her, to a half-grown pup that watched her from behind a trunk with its head tipped and its ears working, and every one of them holding formation around her with the silent, effortless, 6,000-year competence of the only animal Earth ever bred to be trusted without supervision. They were not stalking her. She made herself see it clearly because it mattered, because she would have to describe it later to people who would want to believe otherwise. A stalking pack tightens. It cuts angles, it closes the cone, it drives. This pack held a bubble around her at a constant, courteous distance and moved it up the mountain with her inside it, and the geometry of it was not the geometry of hunting. It was the geometry of an escort. They had decided she was something that belonged to the ground now, and they were walking her home across it the way they'd have walked a lamb. And the effect of realizing that, alone in the green dusk with a dozen guardians the size of ponies, was so overwhelming that Wren had to stop and put her hand against a trunk and breathe until the shaking passed. Ash stopped when she stopped, waited, did not crowd her, when she pushed off the trunk and nodded and said, "Horse, okay. Okay, good boy, go on." He turned and went on, and the escort flowed up the slope with her inside it, and after a while the ground began to level, and the trunks began to thin, and ahead of her the green dusk brightened toward a gray opening in the canopy, and Ash's pace changed, slowed, softened, his head coming down, his whole bearing shifting into something Wren had no word for until she was standing in the opening and understood it all at once. Reverence. The dog's bearing had gone reverent. It was the clearing. It was exactly as the handler's pages had described it, 300 years on, a soft oval of open ground where a gap in the canopy let the gray sky down, the floor gone to a low silver moss, the air even stiller here than below, if that were possible. And across the clearing, in 3 careful rows, were the graves. There were 32 of them. Wren counted because they had waited 300 years for someone to count them. Low mounds, long settled, furred over with the silver moss, and at the head of each one a marker, not human markers, she realized, kneeling at the nearest with her heart in her throat, but stones. Smooth river stones, each about the size of 2 fists, laid at the head of each grave, and some of them were half sunk with age and some sat fresh and clean on the moss, and it took her a long, stupid moment to understand what she was looking at. And when she understood it, she had to sit down in the moss because her legs would not hold her. The dogs had tended the graves. 300 years, 10 generations. No human had told them to. No human could have. But guardians keep what they are given to keep, and the last thing the Cassin handlers had given these dogs to keep was 32 mounds of soft earth in a clearing in the trees. And so the dogs had kept them, had dragged the scavengers off them for 3 centuries, had worn these paths smooth walking the rows on their rounds, and had carried stones. Had brought smooth stones up from some creek below and laid them on the settling ground, generation after generation, not because any instinct in any breeding manual accounted for it, but because a guardian watches what its handlers do and a guardian remembers. And somewhere in the first years, a grieving human had knelt in this clearing and laid a stone on a friend's grave while 6 dogs watched, and the dogs had understood it as part of the keeping, and had never once, in 300 years, stopped. "Oh," Wren said, to no one, to all of them, to 32 people 3 centuries dead. "Oh, you good," and she could not finish it. Ash stood at the edge of the graves with his head lowered and did not come onto them. None of the dogs came onto the graves. They held the edge of the clearing in their loose, courteous ring, and they watched her sit in the moss and come apart, and they let her, the way a good guardian lets its charge cry. And then from the far side of the clearing, from a hollow beneath the roots of the largest tree where the ground was driest and most sheltered, something small moved, and a thin, exhausted voice said, in Thren, in the piping double tone of a settlement child, "Are you a person? I can't tell if you're a person. The big gray one wouldn't let me leave." Wren was up and across the clearing before she decided to move. The child was in the root hollow, wedged back into the dry dark of it on a bed. An actual bed, Wren saw, a nest of moss and shed dog coat and one weathered scrap of prefab insulation that must have lain in this clearing for 3 centuries. And she was small and gray and filthy and shivering, and her eyes were huge and her lips were cracked. But she was alive. She was sitting up, and beside her, curled around the mouth of the hollow, with its bulk making a wall against the cold and the dark and the whole rest of the world, lay one of the young brindle guardians, which lifted its head at Wren's approach and did not move otherwise, because the child was between its paws and the child was the thing it was holding. "Syl," Wren said. She dropped to her knees at the mouth of the hollow, slow, hands open. "Your name's Syl. Your mother sent me. Her name's Danu, and she's down the hill, and she has not slept in 5 days, and she sent me to bring you home. Will your friend let me come closer?" "He's not my friend, he's just warm," the child said, with the flat, exhausted honesty of the very young and the very tired. And then her small gray face crumpled, 300 years of the valley's fear meeting 5 days of a 9-year-old's, and she said, "I chased my toy, and then I couldn't find the trees, and it got dark, and the big gray one found me, and I thought, everybody says, I thought it was going to, but it just pushed me here with its nose, and it lay down, and it wouldn't let me leave. It kept bringing me the little one's catches and putting them by me and growling when I tried to go, and I ate one. I was so hungry I ate one. Am I in trouble?" "You are not in trouble," Wren said, and her voice was steady even though nothing else in her was. "You are the smartest, bravest 9-year-old on this whole world, and you did everything exactly right, and you ate the food good that was smart, that kept you alive." She looked at the young brindle guardian curled around the mouth of the hollow, at its dark, calm eyes watching her over the child's head, and she understood that this dog had spent 5 days doing the second oldest job its breed knew, had found a small lost thing in its territory, and rounded it and bedded it down where the ground was safe and stood over it and held everything off it, had fed it from the pack's own catches, and kept it warm against its own body through 5 cold nights. Because that is what the animal is, that is the thing under the thing. That is the reason a species of hairless, anxious primates had trusted these dogs with their children for 6,000 years and never once been made a fool of for it. You had the best guard in the galaxy, Syl. He never once got it wrong. Now I'm going to reach in slow, and I'm going to pick you up, and we're going to walk out of here together where everybody can see, and your friend here. She looked at the brindle dog and said it as much to him as to the child, in the low, even handler voice. Your friend here is going to let me, because he knows the job's done. Good boy. Good boy, the job's done, I've got her, you can stand down. And the young brindle guardian, 300 years of held instinct behind the deep dark calm of its eyes, looked at the small human for a long moment, and then rose and stepped back off the mouth of the hollow and let her in. Wren gathered the child up. Syl weighed nothing, all sharp cold angles and matted fur-colored settlement clothes, and she wound her thin arms around Wren's neck and pressed her filthy face into Wren's collar and began, finally, to cry the way she must have needed to cry for 5 days and had not dared. And Wren stood up in the clearing with the found child in her arms and turned in a slow circle to say the only thing there was to say. Thank you, she said to the graves, to the pack, to the great gray patriarch standing with his head lowered at the edge of the mounds, to 300 years of the most patient loyalty the universe had ever failed to notice. Thank you, I'm going to come back. I'm going to bring your people the truth, and I'm going to make them understand, and I'm going to relieve your post if it's the last thing I do. Her voice broke on it, and she let it. You held. You all held. It's almost over. Just hold a little longer. Ash lifted his great ash-gray head and looked at her across the graves of the people he had never met and never stopped guarding, and then he turned and walked to the downhill edge of the clearing and looked back at her over his shoulder with the child in her arms, the way a working dog looks back at a handler it means to walk home. And the last of the Cassin line escorted the human and the found child down out of the quiet wood, through the green underwater dusk, the pack flowing around them in its silent, courteous ring, all the way to the last of the trees. And there, at the tree line, at the exact edge of 300 years of held ground, the pack stopped, as it had always stopped, as it had been told to stop by a woman 3 centuries dead, and only Ash came one stride out onto the open moss, into the light, where 400 aliens stood frozen on the rock spine. Wren Halloran walked out of the quiet wood into the gray noon light carrying a living child, with the monster of 3 centuries at her side, and the sound that went up off the rock spine was not a sound she would ever be able to describe to anyone who had not been there to make it. Danu came off the rock spine at a dead run, and no one tried to stop her. She crossed the open moss faster than Wren had thought a Thren could move, and she did not slow when she reached them, did not so much as glance at the enormous ash-gray shape standing one stride out of the trees, because a mother in that moment has room in her whole body for exactly one thing, and the thing was the small gray child lifting her head off Wren's collar and saying, in a cracked whisper, "Mama." Danu took her daughter out of Wren's arms with a sound that the whole valley heard, and folded down onto her knees in the moss with the child against her. And for a long moment there was nothing in the world but an alien mother rocking a found child on open ground below the tree line. And 400 people on a rock spine, learning all at once that they had spent 3 centuries being afraid of the wrong thing. Wren stepped back to give them the moment, and found Ash standing at her shoulder. He had come the second stride out. He stood beside her in the full gray light, in full view of the valley that had feared his line for 300 years, and he was not looking at the crowd or the marshal or the graves he had left up the hill. He was looking at the child in the mother's arms, with the deep, steady attention of a guardian confirming that a charge had been handed safely to the right hands. And only when Danu had the child wrapped and warm and was weeping into her hair did the great head lower, and the massive shoulders lose their tension, and Ash exhale a long, slow breath and turn, at last, to look at Wren. "Yeah," Wren said softly to him alone. "You can let that one go too. She's home, good boy." "She's home." Otku reached them a moment later, And the old warden did a thing then that no Thren had done in 300 years, and that Wren would remember for the rest of her life. He came to a stop 3 strides from the great gray dog, and he lowered himself, slow, joint by joint, until he was kneeling in the moss with his head bowed, an old alien warden on his knees before an Earth guardian. And he said, in the formal double-toned cadence of his people's oldest grief rite, words Wren could not follow but did not need to, because the shape of them was the shape of an apology 3 centuries overdue. Ash regarded the kneeling warden with his calm dark eyes, and did not move, and let the apology be made. It should have ended there. Standing in the moss afterward, Wren let herself believe, for about 4 minutes, that it had ended there, that you could hand a valley the truth in the shape of a rescued child and a kneeling warden and a dog that guarded graves, and the truth would simply do its work, and the fire would be called off, and the 32 would be honored, and the last of the Cass in line would finally, gently, be relieved. Then Marshal Decor's voice came down off the rock's spine, flat and carrying, and Wren remembered that being right had never once, in the whole history of anything, been the same as winning. "The child is recovered," Decor said. "I am glad of it, truly." And she was. Wren could hear that she was, and it made what came next so much worse. "But I want every person on this ridge to look right now at what they are actually seeing and not at what they want to be seeing. Because you are looking at an animal that in 300 years never once crossed its tree line, and that has now crossed it twice in 2 days. She let that land. You are looking at a guardian that held a lost child for 5 days, and you are telling yourselves that is mercy. Hear me. To that animal, that child was not a person. That child was stock, a thing to be kept. It did not return her to her mother. It kept her in a hole in the ground, and it would have kept her there until she starved or froze if the human had not gone up and taken her out, because the animal has no concept of returning, only of holding. You are watching an apex guardian learn that there are small soft things on this side of the trees worth crossing the line to keep. Her coal-orange eyes swept the crowd. How many of your children will it decide are stock? How many will it carry into a hole in the ground to keep safe in its way until they die of its keeping? You are not looking at mercy. You are looking at a hazard that just got a taste of your valley. The fire line goes in tomorrow. And the terrible thing, Wren felt it move through the crowd like cold water, was that it worked, because Decor was not lying. She had taken every true thing Wren had shown them and turned each one a quarter turn into a reason for the fire. And a frightened people reaching for a certainty will always take the version that lets them keep the fear they already know how to hold. Wren watched hope go out of 100 faces on the rock's spine, and fear come back into them, familiar and warm, and she understood that she was not fighting a marshal. She was fighting 300 years, and 300 years had a great deal more practice at this than she did. "She's going to win," Wren said to Otku low, as the crowd began to break and murmur and pull back toward the settlement. "She's turned all of it, the child, the graves, all of it. By tomorrow night half of them will believe the dog was fattening Syl for the winter." "Then we give them something the marshal cannot turn," Otku said. "Such as?" The old warden was quiet for a moment, watching the crowd stream back toward the boundary stones, watching the fear settle back over his people like a coat they'd worn so long it had shaped itself to them. "When I knelt just now," he said, "I spoke the grief rite, the words we say over our own honored dead. I have said them 100 times in 40 years, over wardens and elders and lost children, and every time I have said them, records officer, I have said them over graves that my people tend. That we visit, that we lay stones upon." He turned to look at her. "You told me there are 32 graves in that clearing, tended for 300 years, with stones laid at their heads by an animal that watched a grieving human do it once and never forgot. Do you understand what that is to a Thren? We are a people who bury, who tend, who lay the stone. It is the oldest and most sacred thing we do, and that animal has been doing it, correctly, faithfully, for 3 centuries, over the dead of a species it had never met." He drew a slow breath. "Decor can turn a rescued child into stock. She is clever and she is frightened and she will find the quarter turn. But she cannot stand in front of my people and turn a tended grave into a threat. Not on this world, not to the Thren. The one thing in the universe my people cannot be argued out of revering is a kept grave. Ren stared at him. You want to take them up there, into the clearing? I want to take the marshal up there, Otku said, and the settlement elders, and Syl's mother when she is ready. I want them to stand among 32 graves that an Earth Guardian has tended for 300 years and lay their own stones, and then I want the marshal to explain to their faces why she means to burn a cemetery. His gray face had set into something Ren had not seen in it before, not the careful fear of 40 years at a boundary, but the flat, immovable certainty of a man who has finally found the one ground he will not be moved off. She has the authority to burn a haunted mountain, records officer. I do not think even a reclamation marshal has the authority to burn our dead, or theirs, and I mean to make her say the word graves out loud in front of my whole valley before she says the word fire again. Ren looked at the old warden for a long moment, and then up the slope at the tree line, where Ash still stood, watching the valley empty, holding his post out of old habit even now. Tomorrow the fire line goes in, she said. That doesn't give us long. Then we go up at first light, Otku said. Before the crews, you, me, the marshal if she'll come, the elders, and we let them see. He almost smiled. On a Thren it was a small careful pull at the corners of the wide gray mouth. You walk them halfway to the truth with a child records officer. Let an old warden walk them the rest of the way with the dead. It is the one thing I know how to do. But there were some in the valley that Decor's turned truths had reached faster than any child or any grave could, and they did not mean to wait for first light. And one of them was a young scout named Tavi, who had stood on the ridge the first morning and watched the monster lie down in the moss, and had not slept properly since. He went up that night with 5 others. They were not bad people. Tavi would have wanted anyone telling the story afterward to understand that. They were frightened people, which is a different and more dangerous thing, and the marshal's words had gone into them like a splinter, that the animal had learned there were soft things worth crossing the line to keep, that a valley of children lay under a hazard that had just gotten its taste. They took long guns from the settlement's predator defense locker, the heavy ones meant for marsh stalkers, and they went up the eastern moss in the dark while the burn crews unspooled their coils on the far ridge, and their reasoning was the oldest bad reasoning there is. Kill it now, while it's calm, while it trusts, while the human has made it tame and slow and easy. Kill it tonight and the whole question is closed before anyone can talk us out of it. Tavi led them because he knew the ground. He did not want to lead them. He led them because the alternative was letting them go up without someone who had at least seen the animal up close, and because some part of him had not yet admitted that this was the true reason he could not sleep, that he did not want the thing in the wood to be a monster, and was terrified that it wasn't, and had come up the mountain in the dark half hoping to be stopped. They were stopped, not the way any of them expected. They came up onto the open moss below the tree line with their long guns up and their lamps off, moving the way frightened armed people move, too fast and too loud, and they got within 30 strides of the trees before Tavi understood that the dark ahead of them was not empty. The pack was already there. It had come down out of the wood without a sound, the whole line of it, and it stood across the tree line in the starlight in a loose, unhurried rank, facing them, and it did not snarl, and it did not crouch, and it did not so much as shift its weight. It simply stood, 14 great gray shapes between 6 armed men and the graves, and looked at them with the calm, patient attention of an animal that has already measured a threat and found it small, and waited to see what the men would do. Tavi had hunted marsh stalkers. He knew what a predator looked like when it meant to charge, the drop, the coil, the tell. There was none of that here, and that was precisely the thing that stopped his heart in his chest, because he understood, standing on that dark moss with a long gun he suddenly could not remember how to raise, that the stillness was worse than any charge. A charging animal has committed. You can shoot a charging animal. This was not that. This was 300 pounds of guardian at the head of its line, standing perfectly calm at the edge of ground it had held against everything for 3 centuries, letting 6 men with guns look at exactly how calm it was, so that they would have time, all the time in the world, to think about what that calm meant. One of the men behind Tavi began, very quietly, to make a sound in his throat. "Don't," Tavi whispered. He did not know he was going to say it. "Don't raise it. Nobody raise it. Look at them. Look at how they're standing. They're not going to come at us. They've never come at us. 300 years and they've never crossed to come at us, and they're not crossing now. They're just—" His voice shook. "They're just letting us see. They want us to see. Don't give them a reason. For the love of everything, don't give them a reason." The man with the sound in his throat raised his gun anyway. It never came level. Tavi would spend the rest of his life unable to say exactly what happened in the next second, because nothing happened, and the nothing was the most frightening thing he had ever lived through. The great gray patriarch simply took one slow step forward onto the open moss, and stopped, and lowered its head a hand's width, and looked at the man with the raised gun with those calm, dark, unhurried eyes, and did not do anything else at all. It did not need to. The man made a small broken sound and his nerve came apart in his hands, and the gun barrel dropped, and then all of them were backing away down the moss, fast, then faster, then running. 6 armed men fleeing an animal that had taken exactly 1 step and never so much as bared a tooth, and the pack watched them go and did not follow, because it had never once in 300 years needed to follow anything off its ground to teach it the edge of the world. Tavi was the last to run, and he was ashamed of the running even as he did it, and he stopped at the bottom of the moss, gasping, and looked back. The pack had already melted into the trees. Only the old gray dog remained, a pale shape at the tree line in the starlight, watching him specifically, Tavi felt, the one who had said don't, and then it too turned and was gone into the wood, back to the graves, back to the watch, and Tavi stood alone on the dark moss with a long gun he had not fired and a certainty he could not put down. He was at the settlement hall before dawn waiting when Otku came for the first light walk, and he set the long gun on the map table where the survey stills had been, and he said to the old warden and to anyone who would listen, "I went up to kill it in the night. 6 of us did, and it let us live. It stood there and let us see exactly how easily it could have not, and then it let us run." His young face was gray. "Warden, I have hunted the marshes my whole life. I know what a killer looks like when it's decided. That animal decided nothing tonight except to let 6 fools go home to their families. Whatever the marshal says it is. I stood 30 strides from it with a gun, and it looked at me like I was a child who'd wandered somewhere he shouldn't, and it walked me to the edge of its ground and sent me home. That is not a hazard. I don't know the word for what that is. But it is not a hazard, and I will not stand on the ridge and watch it burn, and neither, when they hear this, will anyone else who was up there tonight." He went up the mountain again at first light, with the delegation this time on the right side of it. And the long gun stayed on the map table, unfired, where the whole valley could see it, all through the days that followed. 6 frightened people's answer to the question of what the wood was, left lying next to the roll of the 32. That night the accelerant cedars came in on the freight shuttle, 6 of them, squat drum-bellied craft that settled onto the settlement pad with the tick of cooling metal, and the burn crews walked off them in reclamation gray and began, under floodlight, to unspool the long orange coils of fire line along the western ridge, and the valley slept badly under the smell of accelerant, and up on the ridge above the coils, the last of the Cassin line lay at the edge of its wood, chin on its pale forepaws, and watched the lights move and held. Marshal Decor did not sleep at all. She stood on the settlement pad in the small hours, among her cooling cedars and her unspooling crews, and she did the thing she had done the night before 9 burns on 9 worlds, which was to walk the edge of the thing she meant to destroy and be certain. She had built a career on certainty. You could not do this work without it. A marshal who hesitated over a haunted mountain got people killed, and Decor had never gotten people killed. And the way you never got people killed was that you looked at a hazard and you saw a hazard and you did not let it become anything else in your mind. Not a legend, not a mercy, not a dog with a name. She had a name now, though. That was the trouble. The human had given the thing a name in front of everyone, Ash, and a named thing was harder to burn. And Decor knew that about herself and had spent the whole day fighting it, turning every true thing back into a hazard, and she had won the crowd doing it. And she had not been able to sleep because winning the crowd had not, for the first time in her career, won her. She kept seeing the human sit down in the moss. 25 strides from 300 pounds of guardian that had killed everything that ever came at it, and the human had sat down, unarmed, and opened a book, and read to it in a low, even voice, and the animal had lain down in the open. Decor had handled animals her whole life. She knew, in the part of her that could not be argued with, exactly how much you had to understand a creature to do what that small human had done, and she knew that you did not burn a thing you understood that well. You only burned things you had refused to understand. That was the whole engine of her career, she saw now, standing among her cedars in the accelerant dark. 9 burns on 9 worlds, and every one of them a thing she had made certain not to understand first, because understanding was the one thing that could stay her hand, and a marshal's hand must not be stayed. Up on the ridge, a mile off in the dark, she could just make out the shape of it against the paler mist, the great low ash-gray wall of the animal, lying at the edge of its trees, watching her lights. You held for 300 years, Marshal Decor said to it to herself, to no one, out on the pad in the dark. Nobody ever came, nobody ever said stop, and you held anyway. She was quiet a while. I have never once in my life held anything I wasn't ordered to. She did not sleep. At first light, when the old warden came to the pad and said formally that the settlement elders and Syl's mother and the marshal herself were invited to walk up into the wood and see the graves before the fire line was lit, Marshal Decor looked at him for a long moment with her red-rimmed coal-orange eyes, and then she said the thing that surprised her more than it surprised him. "Yes," she said, "I'll come. I want to see them. A marshal should see what she burns." She turned to her crew chief. "Hold the line. Nobody lights anything until I am back down off that mountain and I give the word myself. Nobody." And then quieter, so only the warden heard it. "If I am going to do this, warden, I am going to do it with my eyes open. It is the only decent thing I have left to offer them. And if I cannot do it with my eyes open—" She did not finish because she did not yet know the end of the sentence, and Marshal Decor did not speak sentences she could not finish. They went up into the wood at first light. An old warden, a grieving mother, 4 settlement elders, and a reclamation marshal who had never in her life gone up a mountain to be talked out of a fire. And the small human went ahead of all of them, and the great gray dog came down out of the trees to meet her, and led them all in. The pack let them come. That was its own kind of miracle, and Wren watched it land on the thren as they climbed. The way the great gray shapes materialized out of the trunks to either side, and paced the delegation up the slope in that same loose courteous ring, and the way the elders' terror slowly, over the first few hundred meters, curdled into something else, because you cannot stay purely afraid of an animal that is walking you carefully uphill and stopping every time the slowest of you stops. By the time the ground leveled, and the trunks thinned and the gray opening of the clearing showed ahead, the 4 settlement elders had gone silent in a different register than fear, and Marshal Decor was walking with her head turning slowly side to side, counting the escort, reading the geometry of it, and Wren saw the exact moment the marshal's professional eye registered what the geometry was and was not, and something in the broad gray face went still. Then they came out into the clearing, and every thren in the delegation stopped as if they had walked into a wall. Wren had tried to describe it the night before to Otku. She had failed. There was no describing it. There was only standing in it. The soft silver moss, the gray sky let down through the gap in the canopy, and the 32 graves in their 3 careful rows, furred over with 3 centuries of moss, each with its smooth river stone laid at the head, and the worn paths between them where 10 generations of guardians had walked their rounds. The stillness of the place was not empty. It was the stillness of a room that is kept. The elders stood at the edge of it and made small broken sounds, and Syl's mother Danu put her hand over her mouth, and Otku, who had knelt before the dog the day before, now stood very straight and said, in the formal double tone, "These are tended graves." He said it as a legal finding. He said it the way a magistrate says a verdict. "These are tended graves," he said again louder, so the elders and the marshal could not pretend not to have heard it, kept and stoned and guarded, unbroken for 300 years. By the law of the Thren, older than the settlement, older than the reclamation, older than any authority that has ever set foot in this valley, a tended grave is sanctuary. A tended grave may not be broken, burned, plowed, or unmade, and the ground it sits in may not be taken, for as long as the stone remains at its head. He turned slowly and fixed his old eyes on Marshal Decor. "There are 32 stones in this clearing, Marshal, every one of them still at its head. Read the law however you like. There is no reading of it under which you may put fire to this ground." Decor did not answer him. She had walked out among the graves. Ren watched her go, the big gray Dravith stepping carefully between the mounds, and understood that Otku's legal argument, however true, was not the thing that was happening. The thing that was happening was that a marshal who had burned 9 worlds was walking among 32 tended graves and reading, one after another, the smooth river stones that an animal had laid, and that no argument any warden could make would matter 1/10 as much as whatever the marshal found written in that walk. She stopped at the smallest grave. It was in the 3rd row, shorter than the others, and Ren had noticed it the first day and made herself not think about it, because there is a length of grave that tells you the age of what is under it, and this one was very short. At its head sat not 1 river stone, but a small cairn of them, 7 or 8, the most on any grave in the clearing, laid up over 3 centuries by generation after generation of guardians who had, in whatever way the deep patient mind of the breed did its accounting, understood that this was the grave that most needed keeping. "There's a child here," Decor said. Her flat carrying voice had gone strange. "The graves are all the same but this one's a child." "There would be," Ren said quietly. "The blight took the weakest first. There'd have been children." She came out among the graves to stand near the marshal, near the little cairn. "The dogs know. Look at the stones. They gave this one the most. 300 years, and every generation of them came to this grave and left more than the others, because a guardian knows the difference between a grave and a child's grave, and it never once stopped mattering to them." She looked up at the big gray marshal. "You said yesterday the animal would keep our children in a hole until they die of its keeping. Marshal, it has been keeping a child's grave for 300 years. It knows exactly what a child is. It knows exactly what it means to fail to keep one warm enough. That's why it never let Syl out of that hollow, not because she was stock. Because 300 years ago its line already lost a small one to the cold in this clearing, and it was not going to lose another." Marshal Decor stood over the little cairn for a long time. Around them the clearing held its breath, the elders at the edge, Danu with her hand still at her mouth, the pack ringed silent among the trunks, and Ash standing at the head of the 3 rows with his great head lowered, exactly where he had stood the day before, in the posture Ren had no better word for than reverence. And into that stillness, one by one, without anyone giving an order, the settlement elders came out among the graves, and each of them bent and took up a smooth stone from the clearing floor, and laid it on a grave, in the oldest and most sacred gesture their people knew. A Thren adding a stone to a tended grave, welcoming the dead into the keeping of the living. 300 years and 32 lives too late, but done, finally done, at last. Danu laid hers on the child's cairn. She did not say anything. She did not have to. And Marshal Decor, who had come up the mountain to keep her eyes open while she decided whether to burn it, reached down and took up a smooth gray stone from the moss, and turned it over once in her broad gray fingers, and laid it, very carefully, at the head of the child's grave, beside the mother's. On top of 300 years of stones an animal had laid there before either of them was born. "Hold the line," she said, so quietly that only Wren heard it, and Wren understood that the marshal was not giving an order. She was reading one. She was reading, off the little cairn and the worn paths and the 32 unbroken stones, the order that this ground had been holding for 3 centuries, and she was, for the first time in her hard, certain life, choosing to hold a thing she had not been ordered to hold. "There will be no burn," Decor said, louder now, turning to the elders, to Otku, to the clearing. "Not here, not the wood, not any part of the massif. I will file it myself. I will put my own name to the sanctuary finding, and I will spend the rest of my commission defending it if I have to. And any reclamation officer who wants to overturn it can come up this mountain and lay their own stone on this child's grave first, and then explain to me why they're removing it." Her coal-orange eyes had gone bright and hard. "Warden, records officer, I have burned 9 worlds. I told myself every one of them was a hazard. I understood. I understand now that I made certain never to understand them, because understanding is the thing that stays your hand, and I could not afford a stayed hand." She looked down at the stone she had laid. "My hand is stayed. Let it be stayed. Let this be the one I did not burn." Wren opened her mouth to say something. She never knew afterward what, and never said it, because that was the moment the wind shifted, and the smell came up the mountain into the clearing, and every dog in the pack lifted its head at once. "Smoke." Wren knew it before her mind named it, the way you know a wrong sound in a familiar house. Wood smoke, and under it the sharp chemical bite of accelerant, and the pack was up and turned to face downhill as one animal, and ash had come away from the graves at a fast working pace to the downhill edge of the clearing, head high, testing the wind, and the whole loose courtesy of the escort had gone taut and urgent in a single breath. "No," Decor said. "No, I gave the order. I told them to hold. Nobody lights anything until I—" She was already moving, and Wren saw the horror break across the broad gray face as she reached for the comm at her collar and got nothing but the flat hiss of a signal the mountain had eaten. "The ridge. The mountain blocks the relay. They never got the hold, the schedule." She spat something in Dravith that needed no translation. "The provincial timer. The burn was authorized on a fixed clock. If a marshal doesn't countermand by the mark, it proceeds automatically. It's a safety protocol. It's meant to stop a burn from stalling when a crew loses its officer. And I'm up a mountain with no signal, and the mark was." She looked at the smoke rolling up out of the west. "The mark was dawn. They've started. The cedars have started the western line, and I cannot reach them, and this whole massif is dry." For 1 frozen second nobody in the clearing moved. 32 tended graves, a pack of guardians facing the smoke. An old warden, a grieving mother, 4 elders, a marshal, and a small human, standing in the one place on the whole world that could not be allowed to burn, while the fire the marshal herself had ordered came up the mountain on a clock that would not take her word back. Then Wren Halloran turned and ran for the downhill trees, and Ash ran with her, and behind them the whole clearing broke into motion, and the race for the quiet wood began. They came out of the trees into a valley, already the wrong color. The western ridge, a mile off across the massif's shoulder, was on fire. Not the roaring wall Wren's imagination had built on the way down, not yet, but a long, low, creeping line of orange along the crest where the cedar drones had laid their accelerant and lit it, and above it a dirty brown haze climbing into the gray morning, and the smell of it rolling down the slope ahead of a wind that was blowing, Wren saw with a lurch from the west, toward them, toward the wood, toward the graves. The whole valley was on the rock spine, and the open moss below the tree line. They had come, as they had come every day now, to watch, and they had arrived to find the fire already lit, and the delegation not yet down, and they were milling in the terrible, helpless way of a crowd that has been handed a catastrophe with no instructions. Some of them already streaming back toward the settlement to save what they could, some of them frozen, all of them looking up the wrong slope at the wrong fire. Marshal Decor came out of the trees 3 strides behind Wren, and did not break stride. Wren would remember that afterward as the moment she stopped being afraid of the marshal and started, against all sense, to trust her, because a lesser officer, a frightened officer, an officer whose whole certainty had just been unmade among 32 graves, would have faltered, and Decor did not falter for so much as a step. She took in the burning ridge, the wind, the crowd, the wood, in one sweep of the coal-orange eyes, and then she was moving down the slope toward the settlement pad and her cedars and her crew, and her flat carrying voice went out across the whole valley like a blade. "Reclamation crew on me, now." It cut through the milling crowd and heads snapped toward her. "The burn is aborted. The burn is aborted. The sanctuary finding is filed under my name, and if that line reaches the eastern wood you will all answer to me for a burned cemetery. I need the 3 intact cedars airborne in 90 seconds. We are not lighting a burn. We are cutting a break." She reached the pad at a near run, her crew scrambling up out of their stunned stillness around her. "We lay a wet line and a backfire along the eastern shoulder, here to here." She was at the map table, her broad gray finger slashing a line between the creeping fire and the dark mass of the quiet wood. "We take out the fuel before the main line reaches it, and we hold the wood. We hold the wood. Say it back to me." "We hold the wood," her crew chief said, already running for the cedars. And then Marshal Decor turned to the valley. The whole frightened, milling Thren Valley, 300 years of people who had been taught since infancy that the one safe thing to do about that wood was to stay away from it. And she said the thing that broke the last of 3 centuries in half. "People of Tellen," she said, "I came here to burn that wood. I was wrong. There are 32 graves in it that an animal has tended for 300 years, and there is a child's grave among them, and there is the truth your warden has been trying to hand you. I cannot save it with 3 cedars and a crew. I need hands. I need every one of you who can carry a beater or a water can or a wet blanket, and I need you to go toward that wood, not away from it, and help me hold the line the animal has held for 300 years. Her voice did not plead. It simply told them the truth and let it stand. You have been afraid of the wrong thing your whole lives. Here is your chance to find out what you're actually made of. Who's with me?" For one held breath, the valley did not move. Then Danu, Syl's mother, who had come down out of the clearing with them, whose daughter that wood had kept alive, stepped out of the crowd and picked up a beater off the fire crew's stack, and turned and started up the eastern slope toward the wood, alone, a small gray figure walking toward the one thing her people had run from for 3 centuries. And Otku went after her, and then the 4 elders, still with the clearing stones warm in their hands, and then, the way a dam does not break all at once but at one weak place, and then everywhere, the valley moved. They came off the rock spine and out of the settlement lanes. They took up beaters and blankets and water cans, and they went up the eastern shoulder toward the quiet wood in a long, ragged stream. 300 years of fear turning inside out in the space of a single morning, an entire people running toward the wood to save it. Wren stood at the edge of the pad and watched it happen, and could not move for the size of it. "Records officer," Decor's voice at her shoulder, low and fast now just for her. "The cedars will hold the eastern shoulder. But the drones that are still running the western line are autonomous. They finished their ignition run and they've gone to holding pattern, and they will not stop laying spot fires ahead of the main line until they get a physical abort at the staging mast, and the staging mast is up on the western ridge, above the fire on the far side of the line." She pointed. Wren followed her finger to a spindly tower on the burning crest, half lost in the brown haze. "Someone has to get to that mast and pull the physical abort, or the drones will keep seeding spot fires faster than we can cut break, and we lose the whole massif, wood and all. My crew is committed to the wet line. I cannot spare them. And the only ground route to that mast that isn't already burning," she stopped. "Is through the wood," Wren said. "Is through the wood," Decor said. "Up the eastern edge under the canopy where the fire hasn't reached, across the top and down onto the western ridge behind the fire line. A person who knew the wood could do it in 20 minutes. I don't have a person who knows the wood. Nobody knows the wood." She looked at Wren, and there was something in the coal-orange eyes that was almost an apology. "Except." Wren was already looking up the slope, at the tree line, where Ash stood in the drifting smoke with his pack around him, head high, watching the fire come toward the graves he had tended for 300 years. "Except him," she said. She did not remember deciding. She remembered running, up the eastern moss toward the tree line, the smoke thickening, the log left behind on the pad, everything left behind, running toward the wood with her lungs already burning, and Ash coming down to meet her the way he always came down to meet her, the great ash-gray shape breaking out of the smoke. And she did not slow. She went straight to him, close, closer than she had ever been, close enough to put her hand flat on the broad gray slab of his shoulder for the first time. Feeling the astonishing heat and hardness and life of him under the weather-matted coat, and she said, in the low, even handler voice, fast and clear, "Ash, the graves are going to burn. Your graves, Ash, the ones you've been holding, the little one's grave. They're going to burn unless we get to the top of the ridge and I shut off the thing that's making the fire. I can't find the way. You know the way. You've always known the way." She fisted her hand in the coat at his shoulder and looked into the deep dark calm of his eyes, and 300 years looked back at her, unhurried even now, even with the smoke and the fire and the whole valley streaming up the slope behind her. "Show me the way, Ash. Take me up, take me over the top, one more time. Hold the line one more time and show me the way." For one heartbeat the great head stayed level, and the calm eyes held hers. Then Ash turned and went into the wood at a hard, working lope, and Wren went after him, and the pack closed around them both, and the quiet wood took them up into itself for the last run. It was nothing like the walk. The walk had been slow and courteous and reverent. This was headlong, the great gray shapes flowing up through the trunks at a pace Wren could barely hold, and she did hold it, because the alternative was to lose them in the smoke and the green dusk and die alone in a burning wood, and because some animal part of her had understood, running, that she was not leading this and had never been leading this, that she was a small soft thing being carried up a mountain inside a bubble of guardians who had decided she belonged to the ground, and that her one job was to keep her feet and trust the escort. The smoke thickened as they climbed. The green dusk went brown. She could hear the fire now, a low continuous roar off to the left and above, and once a burning branch came down through the canopy in a shower of sparks not 20 strides away, and the pack simply flowed around the gap without breaking stride and closed again on the far side, and she ran through the place where it had fallen with her arm over her face, and kept her eyes on the pale gray blur of ash ahead of her, and did not stop. They crossed the top in the worst of it, a stretch where the canopy had already caught, and the wood was no longer cool and green, but a hot orange chaos of falling light and rolling smoke, and Wren lost all sense of direction. And it did not matter, because Ash had not lost it. Ash had never once in his life lost the edges of his own ground, and she followed the pale shape of him through a burning wood on nothing but 300 years of a guardian knowing exactly where he was. And then the trees fell away and the ground dropped and they were out on the bare western ridge, behind the fire line, in the acrid open air, with the spindly staging mast standing 30 strides off across a slope of bare rock, its drones circling it in their patient idiot-holding pattern, still ready to see the next spot fire on their dead clock. Wren ran for the mast, Ash ran beside her. And behind them, ringing the burning crest, holding the edge of the bare rock against the fire the way they had held the edge of everything for 3 centuries, the pack fanned out and stood, and did the only thing they had ever been asked to do, and held the line while their human reached the mast, and found the red physical abort under its cover, and pulled it. And the drones, one after another, dropped out of their holding pattern and settled onto the rock and went dark and still. The fire had no more help coming. And down on the eastern shoulder, a mile back through the smoke, 3 cedars and a crew and an entire valley of people who had been afraid of a wood for 300 years were cutting a wet line to save it. On the eastern shoulder, Otku fought a fire for the first time in his life and learned, in the space of an hour, more about his own people than he had learned in 40 years of keeping them safe. He had not known they had it in them. That was the shameful truth of it, and he let himself feel it while he swung a wet blanket against the leading edge of a spot fire in the bracken, coughing, his eyes streaming. For 40 years he had thought of his valley as Decor had described it, a people who had agreed to be smaller than they were, who had fenced off a third of their land and taught their children to be afraid. He had thought of himself as their keeper, and a keeper's whole art is the management of frightened things. And now he stood on a burning shoulder of the massif, and watched those same frightened people run toward the fire with beaters and water cans and their own coats, watched the elders form a bucket line down to the creek, watched settlement youths he'd have sworn couldn't be driven within a mile of the wood beating out spot fires 10 strides from the tree line while the smoke rolled over them. And he understood that he had been wrong about them in exactly the way the whole valley had been wrong about the wood. The fear had never been the truth of them. The fear had only been the story they'd been handed. Hand them a different story. Hand them 32 tended graves and a child pulled living from the trees and a marshal saying go toward the wood, and this was what came out of them. This. Warden, Decor's crew chief, at his elbow, soot black, pointing. The wet lines holding on the low ground, but the main front's going to crown when it hits the resin pines on the north spur, and if it crowns, it jumps the line. We need the north spur wetted before the front reaches it, and my cedars are committed south. Can your people? My people can, Otku said, and was distantly amazed to find that he believed it. He turned and pitched his voice into the double-toned carry his ancestors had used to call herds across valleys, and he sent 40 thren up the north spur with water cans. And they went, coughing, terrified, going anyway, up toward the crowning fire, and Otku went with them. An old marchwarden who had spent his whole life keeping people away from danger, leading them into it at last, and finding. This was the thing he would not have believed the week before. That leading them into it to save something was a better use of 40 years than keeping them away from it had ever been. The front hit the north spur an hour past noon. For a while it was very bad. The resin pines went up the way the crew chief had feared, a wall of orange leaping the wetted ground in a roar of superheated air, and the line of thren on the spur broke and fell back, and for a few minutes Otku thought they had lost it, thought the fire would take the spur and crown down into the eastern wood, and reach the graves after all. 300 years of keeping undone in an afternoon by a clock and a lost signal. He stood in the smoke and the falling ash and made himself ready to watch it burn. And then the wind turned. It turned the way mountain wind turns in the afternoon when the slopes heat unevenly, a thing any old warden of the massif should have counted on, and none of them in the panic had. It backed around into the north and came down off the high cold rock and pushed the crown fire back over its own burned ground, where it found nothing left to eat, and faltered, and dropped out of the canopy, and became again a low creeping thing the bucket lines could reach. Otku did not call it a miracle. He had had enough of miracles that week. He called it wind, and he took the gift of it, and he sent his people back up the spur into the smoke to beat out the faltering front while it was down. And this time they held, and the line held, and slowly, through the long acrid afternoon, the fire that Marshal Decor had ordered and Marshal Decor had aborted began, under the hands of the people it had been meant to protect, to die. Wren came down off the western ridge into the middle of it. She came down through the burned-over top of the wood behind Ash and the pack, out onto the eastern shoulder where the bucket lines were, and the first person to see her was a settlement youth who dropped his water can and simply pointed, wordless, at the small soot-black human walking out of the smoking trees with the monster of the quiet wood at her side, and 11 more of its kind flowing down the slope behind her. The bucket line stopped. And Wren, too exhausted and smoke-sick to understand for a moment what they were staring at, followed their eyes to the great gray shapes emerging from the trees around her, and understood, and did the only thing there was to do. "They're here to help," she croaked. "They know the wood better than any of us. They know where it wants to burn." She turned to Ash, and she was so tired that the handler voice came out cracked and small, but it came out. "Show them, Ash. Show them the weak places. Hold the line." Whether the dog understood the words or only the exhaustion and the urgency and the smoke and 300 years of holding lines against everything that threatened his ground, Wren never knew, and it did not matter, because a fire is a thing that comes at a guardian's territory meaning harm, and that was a sentence the Cassin line had always known how to finish. The pack fanned out along the tree line, and they did not fight the fire. They were dogs, not firefighters, but they ranged the edge of the wood ahead of the Thren, and where they stopped and stood and would not be moved, the fire was coming, and where they flowed on, it was not, and the bucket lines learned within 20 minutes to read the pack the way Wren had learned to read Ash, to put their water and their beaters where the great gray shapes planted themselves. And with a dozen 300-year-old guardians reading the fire's intent off the mountain they had held for 3 centuries, the Thren stopped losing ground. By dusk it was over. The fire died against the wet line and the burned-over top and the turned wind and the sheer stubbornness of a valley that had decided, 300 years too late and just barely in time, that the wood was worth saving. The last of the front guttered out on the north spur in the blue smoke of evening, and the bucket lines came apart into knots of soot-black exhausted people sitting where they'd stood, and up on the eastern shoulder the quiet wood stood dark and mostly whole against the dimming sky, its top edge burned but its heart untouched, the clearing and the 32 graves and the little cairn safe under the unburned canopy, held, one more time, held. Wren found Decor at the wet line, filthy, one sleeve burned through, directing the last of her crew as they killed the final hotspots. The marshal looked at the human for a long moment across the smoking ground. "The mast," Decor said. "Dark, all the drones are down, nothing else is going to light." Wren's legs chose that moment to stop working, and she sat, hard on a scorched rock, and Ash came and stood over her the way the young Brindle had stood over Syl, a wall against the whole rest of the world, and she leaned her soot-black head against his foreleg and did not care who saw. "We held it." "You held it," Decor said. She came and lowered herself onto the rock beside the human, a burned and exhausted marshal sitting in the ash next to a small human and a guardian the size of a pony, and for a while neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying that the standing wood behind them was not already saying better. Then Decor said, quietly, looking at the dark mass of the trees, 9 worlds. "I burned 9 worlds, records officer, and told myself every one of them was a hazard I understood. And it took a fire I lit myself, and a wood full of graves, and an animal that ran into it to save the dead of a species that isn't even its own, to teach me the difference between a hazard and a thing you don't understand yet." She was quiet again. "I'm going to spend the rest of my commission going back to the other 8, to see what I burned, to find out what I made certain not to understand." She looked down at the great gray dog standing guard over the exhausted human. "I don't expect any of them will have held for 300 years, but I'd like to know their names at least. It seems the smallest thing I can do. Learn the names of the things I was too certain to look at." Wren didn't answer. She had fallen asleep against the dog's foreleg, in the ash in the blue smoke of evening, on a mountain her species had saved by finally telling the truth about it. And Marshal Decor looked at the sleeping human and the patient guardian and the standing wood, and did not wake her, and sat the watch beside them until Otku came down off the north spur in the last light to say that the fire was out, and the graves were safe, and the valley, for the first time in 300 years, was not afraid. The valley did not go back to what it had been. A place cannot, Once it has run toward the thing it spent 300 years running from. In the days after the fire, Wren Halloran barely left the archive, and for once it was not because she was alone with the dead. It was because the whole valley kept coming to the door. They came in ones and twos, settlement folk who had never in their lives had reason to speak to the junior human records officer, and they stood in the doorway of the grain store turning their hands over, and they asked her the question that all of them now needed answered. Who were they? The 32. Tell us their names. We have laid stones on them. Tell us whose stones we laid. So Wren told them. She went back into Crate 41 and she built, out of the Cassin Expedition's manifest and its medical log and its handler's pages, a roll of the dead, 32 names, with ages, with the small human facts the log let her recover. The soil chemist who had missed the blight and then worked himself to death trying to undo it. The cook who, the last handler's page recorded, had gone on making hot meals for the dying until the day she could no longer stand. The comms officer weeping in his margins over an evac window for people who mostly would not live to use it. And the child in the third row, the small grave with the tallest cairn, a girl of 7 named Elu Cassin, daughter of the expedition's lead. The first of them the blight took, buried by her own father in the clearing while 6 dogs watched him lay the first stone. Wren wrote the roll out fair, in her best hand, on good paper, and Otku had it set in the settlement hall where the survey maps had been, and the valley came to read it, and to learn the names of the people their wood had kept, and something that had been clenched in the Tellen Reach for 300 years began slowly to unclench. Marshal Decor left on the 10th day. She filed the sanctuary finding first, filed it under her own name, as she had promised, a reclamation marshal formally designating the entire Eastern Massif inviolable protected ground, a cemetery under the oldest Thren law and now under coalition law besides, and she did it in language so immovable that Wren, reading the copy, understood that Decor had written it specifically so that no future officer could ever do what she herself had almost done. She came to the archive to say goodbye, filling the low doorway the way she had filled the hall the first night, and she looked at the wall of 32 reconstructed lives, and she said, "You did a thing I did not know could be done, records officer. You changed a mind that had been made up for a very long time." Mine, she almost smiled, on a Dravith it was a small hard flicker. I have never been anyone's second thoughts before. It is not comfortable. I find I would not trade it. At the door she stopped. The animal, Ash, he's old, isn't he? I've handled enough guardians to see it in the coat, the way he moves in the cold. He's old, Wren said. Guardians go 12, 13 years. He's near the end of it. Then finish it, Decor said. Whatever it is you mean to do, the relieving, the standing down, whatever human thing is in your head that you haven't said out loud to anyone, do it while he can still know it's being done. Don't let the last of that line die at his post because the people who owed him his relief were too slow to give it. She looked out toward the Massif, dark and whole against the morning. I have left too many things too long myself. Don't. And she went up the ramp of the freight shuttle, off to the other 8 worlds she had burned, to learn the names of what she had been too certain to see, and Wren never saw her again. Though a year later a crate arrived at the archive from a world Wren had never heard of, and in it was a roll of names in Decor's own hard hand, of the dead of a place the marshal had burned before she learned to look. Her penance, sent to the one person she trusted to understand it. Wren went up to read to Ash every day. That did not change after the fire. If anything, it deepened, because now she was not going up to prove anything to a valley or to buy time against a burn. She was going up because it had become the shape of her days and because the old dog she could see was failing. He came down to meet her more slowly now. He lay down sooner. The cold got into him and he sought the sun, and when she read he would put his great gray head in her lap, the whole heavy weight of it, and sleep while she read, and the pack lay in a loose ring around them in the moss below the tree line. And the mist moved in the trees, and it was, Wren thought, the most peaceful hour of her life. Every day, sitting at the edge of a wood her species had haunted for 3 centuries with the head of its guardian heavy and trusting in her lap. And the valley began to come. That was the change that undid her a little every time. They came the way they'd come to her door, ones and twos at first, at a distance, keeping to the rock spine, watching the small human read to the old dog in the moss. Then closer. Then Danu came, with Syl, and the child, healed, fattened, fearless in the specific way of a child, who has already survived the worst thing the adults were afraid of, walked straight down onto the open moss to the young brindle guardian that had kept her alive, and sat in front of him, and told him at length about her week, and the brindle dog listened with his head tipped and his ears working exactly as he had in the root hollow, and Syl's mother stood at the tree line and wept and did not try to stop her. Then more children, then the elders. Within a month there were Thren sitting in the moss below the quiet wood most afternoons, quiet, unafraid in the company of the pack, and the wood that no living Thren had entered for 300 years had become, without anyone deciding it, the most visited ground in the valley, a place of rest, of tended graves and patient guardians and a small human who read aloud, a place the Talon Reach came to sit and be reminded of what its fear had nearly cost it. Otku petitioned the provincial seat, and then the joint liaison network, and eventually, because the story had traveled, the way that story would travel, the human worlds themselves. It took 2 months for the answer to come, and the answer was better than any of them had dared hope. The Cassin expedition had not been entirely forgotten after all. It had only been mislaid, a pre-accord frontier loss with no follow-up, filed and closed and never reopened, because the 9 survivors the Thren had evacuated 300 years ago had been quarantined, and resettled, and had lived, and had descendants, a whole scattered line of them across 3 human worlds, people who carried the Cassin name or the names of the 8 other families that had come off that ship, and who had grown up with a strange, bitter fragment of family lore about ancestors who died on a cursed world at the edge of the dark, and who had never once, in 300 years, been told that 32 of their people were buried in a clearing and guarded still. They were told now, and they came. Not all of them. It was a long way, and 300 years is a long time to hold a grief you were never given the details of. But 11 of them came, 11 human descendants of the Cassin expedition, across a 2-month journey to the world where their people had died and been kept. Ren met their ship at the provincial seat and rowed back up to the Talon Reach with them, and she watched their faces as the Massif came into view, dark and whole and inviolable, and she told them, on the way, everything the log had told her, so that they would not come to the graves as strangers. And she told them about the dogs. "There's one thing left to do," Ren said to the 11, in the settlement hall the night before, with Otku beside her and the roll of the 32 on the wall behind them, and through the window, the dark shape of the wood against the stars. "Your ancestors left an order in the ground. The last thing anyone wrote in that clearing was that the dogs would hold the line until someone came to relieve them. Nobody ever came. For 300 years and 10 generations, that pack has been standing a post that was never lifted, because the last handler died before she could tell them the war was over, and a guardian does not stand down on its own. It holds until it's relieved. That's the whole soul of the animal, and it's the whole tragedy of it, and tomorrow we're going to fix it." She looked around the ring of human faces, the descendants of the 9 who lived. "Tomorrow, in front of the whole valley, one of you is going to go up to the tree line with me and sit down, and I'm going to read the last order out of the log, and then you, blood of the people those dogs have been guarding for 300 years, are going to give them the order none of them has ever heard. You're going to relieve the post. You're going to tell them they can stand down, and that old gray dog is going to hear, from the actual living kin of the actual people he's been holding the line for, that his people came back, that it's over. That he held and it's over and he can rest." Her voice was steady mostly. "It's the oldest thing our 2 species have between us, and neither of us knew it was there. 32 graves and a pack of dogs that never gave up. Tomorrow we finish what your ancestors started and never got to end." There was a long quiet in the hall. Then the oldest of the 11, a woman named Cassin who carried the lead expedition member's name 300 years on, said, in a voice that shook only a little, "Elu, the child, the one with the most stones. She was, the family story always said, there was a little girl, my however many times grandmother's sister. Elu." She pressed her hand to her mouth and then took it away and said, steadier, "I'll go up. I'll give the order. Let it be someone who carries her name." And Otku, old marchwarden of the Tellin boundary, keeper of the taboo for 40 years, bowed his head and said, "Then in the morning the valley will come, all of it, and we will witness the relief of the post and the peace of the 32 and the standing down of the finest thing either of our peoples ever made. It has been 300 years. Let us not be slow about it now." They came up out of the valley in the gray morning the way they had come to fear the wood and then to save it. All of them, the whole Tellin reach. But this time there was no rock spine to hide behind, and no one tried to use it. Otku walked at the front with the 11 humans, and behind them the valley came in a long, quiet column, elders and children and settlement folk and the fire crews who had stayed on, up the eastern moss to the open ground below the tree line, and they did not stop at the boundary stones, and they did not stop at the rock spine. They came all the way up onto the open moss, hundreds of them, and they spread out along the edge of the wood in a great loose crescent, close enough to see, and they stood in the place their ancestors had taught them was death, and they waited, unafraid, to witness a thing that had been 300 years coming. The pack was already there. They had come down out of the trees at first light, all of them, the whole line. Otku counted 14 now, from the great gray patriarch to the half-grown pup, and they stood in a loose rank along the tree line in the drifting mist, facing the valley, the way Otku imagined they must have stood the day a Thren ship lifted 9 survivors off a plague world 300 years ago and left them to hold. They were not agitated by the crowd. They were guardians. A crowd on their open ground was simply a thing to be held, and they held it, calm and enormous and patient, and the valley looked at them across 40 strides of moss and understood, all at once and all together, what it was looking at, and a silence came down over the whole gathering that Otku would remember to the end of his life. Ash stood a little forward of the others. He had come down slowly that morning, and Otku had watched Ren walk up to meet him and put her hand on his shoulder and murmur something. And now the old gray dog stood at the head of his line in the gray light, 4 legs planted, head level, the ash-dark back and the pale legs and the broad, blunt, graying muzzle, and his deep dark eyes moved over the gathered valley with the same unhurried patience the survey stills had caught 300 times, and every one of them had read as a hunter's. Otku knew better now. He knew the patience for what it was. He had spent 40 years afraid of a soldier at a post, waiting for the one face that would tell it the watch was over. Ren Halloran walked out onto the open moss with the log against her chest, and the woman named Cassin at her side, and she sat down in front of the old dog, and the valley stopped breathing. She sat the way she had sat the first day, cross-legged, small, unarmored in the moss below the tree line, 20 strides from 300 pounds of guardian, except that it was not 20 strides now. It was nothing. Ash came away from his line the moment she was down, 3 slow steps out onto the open moss, into the full view of the entire valley, and he lowered himself into the moss beside her and put his great gray head in her lap, the whole heavy trusting weight of it, and closed his eyes, and the sound that went through the crowd was not a gasp this time but something softer and worse. The sound of hundreds of people watching the monster of 3 centuries lay its head in a human's lap like a tired old dog at a hearth, which was the only thing it had ever been. Ren opened the log. 311 years ago, she said, and she did not raise her voice, but the morning was so silent that it carried to the last of the crowd. The people who are buried in this wood came to this world to learn it, and they brought 6 dogs to keep them safe, and then they died. All but 9 of them died, of a sickness in the water that nobody could have seen coming. And at the very end, when they knew most of them weren't going to make it, they carried their dead up into these trees, to a clearing where the ground was soft, and they buried them, and they set their dogs to guard the graves. And the last thing one of them wrote in this book, in a human hand, 311 years ago, was this. She found the page. She had it by heart, but she read it off the page, because it mattered that they see her read it. If we do not come back for them, the dogs will hold. That is what they are. They will hold the line until we relieve them. God help me, they will hold it forever if we let them. She closed the log and laid her hand on the old dog's head. Nobody ever came back, Wren said. The 9 who lived were carried off to a place where they couldn't return, and the world was sealed, and the order was never lifted, and so the dogs did exactly what they said they'd do. They held. 6 became a pack, and a pack became a line, and every generation the old ones taught the young ones the edge of the ground, and the names of the graves, and the one job they were never told they could stop doing. 300 years, 10 generations, standing a post for people who were all long dead, waiting for a relief that was never coming because the last order they were ever given was to hold, and a dog like this does not stand down on its own. It holds until its people come back and tell it that it can rest. Her voice was steady and it carried, and there was not a sound on all that open moss but the wind in the trees. Well, their people came back. It took 300 years and a fire, and a whole valley learning it had been afraid of the wrong thing, but their people came back. She looked up at the woman standing beside her and she said, "Go ahead." And Cassin, descendant of the man who had buried a 7-year-old, named Aloud in a clearing while 6 dogs watched him lay the first stone, blood of the 9 who had lived, of the 32 who had not, knelt down in the moss in front of the last of the Cassin line, and put out one shaking human hand, and rested it on the broad gray head beside Wren's, and said, in a voice that broke and steadied and broke again, the words that no living thing had spoken to that pack in 300 years. The order it had been bred for 6,000 years to wait for, and had waited 3 centuries to hear. We came back, do you hear me? We came back for them, your people came back. The tears were running down her face and she did not wipe them. You held the line, you held it perfectly. You held it for 300 years and you never once broke, not one of you, not for a single day, and we are here now, and we have counted the graves, and every one of them is safe, and every one of them is kept, and it is over. Her hand tightened on the old gray head. The watch is over. You did everything right. You can stand down now. You're relieved. Do you hear me, you good, good dog? You're relieved. The line is relieved. You can rest. For a long moment nothing happened, and Otku, watching, felt his own 3 centuries of fear and grief and shame gather in his chest like a held breath. Then the old dog opened his eyes. He lifted his great head off the 2 hands slowly, and he looked, not at Cassin and not at Wren, but out past all of them, out over the gathered valley and down the long slope toward the sea of grass where, 300 years ago, a ship had stood and then had lifted and then had gone, taking the last of his people away. He looked at that horizon, the horizon he and his line had watched for 300 years, the wrong horizon, the one the relief had never come over. He looked at it for a long, long moment, the way a soldier looks one last time at the country he has held. And then Ash turned away from it. He turned his back on the horizon he had watched for 3 centuries. The first time, Otku understood, that any dog of that line had ever willingly turned its attention away from the edge of its ground, and he looked instead at the small human sitting in the moss beside him, and at the weeping woman with her hand on his head, and at the whole valley of people standing unafraid on the open ground his line had held, and something went out of the old gray body, some tension 300 years deep, some holding that had been bred and taught and inherited across 10 generations, and it simply let go. The great shoulders came down, the level head came down, and the last of the Cassin line lay down in the moss in the gray morning light, in front of the entire valley, and put his head back in the human's lap, and let out a long, slow, shuddering breath, the breath of a thing setting down a weight it has carried so long it had forgotten it was a weight, and rested. Just rested. An old dog in the sun with his head in a lap, off duty for the first time in 300 years. The pack lay down behind him. One after another, all along the tree line, the great gray shapes folded down into the moss, the brindle that had kept still, the lean young ranger, the half-grown pup last of all, watching the old ones and copying them. The whole line standing down together for the first time in 3 centuries, because the patriarch had stood down, and a pack reads its head the way Wren had learned to read ash. 14 guardians lying at ease on the open ground in front of the people they had guarded and terrified and saved, and the valley looked at them, and understood that the war that had ended 300 years ago had, at last, this morning, actually ended. Wren Halloran sat in the moss with the old dog's head heavy in her lap and her hand on the graying muzzle, and she bent down close, and she said the last of it, so quietly that only the dog could hear, in the low, even handler voice, 6,000 years deep. "Good boy," she said. "There it is, there it is. You held the line, you can let it go now. Good boy, Ash, good boy." And behind them the whole wood stood green and whole and safe in the morning, and the 32 slept kept and stoned and honored in their clearing, and 300 years of fear ended not with a fire, and not with a bigger gun, but with an old dog laying down his watch in the sun, relieved at last by the people he had never stopped believing would come. They went up into the clearing that same afternoon, the 11 humans and the old warden and the small records officer, and this time the wood did not have to permit them, because the wood had stood down. That was the strangest and most beautiful thing about the walk, Otku thought, climbing the eastern slope through the green underwater light for the second time in his long life. The escort was gone. There was no loose, courteous ring of guardians pacing them uphill, no geometry of held ground, because there was no held ground anymore. The pack came with them, but it came the way dogs come, ranging ahead and doubling back, the pup crashing joyfully through the needle drift after some scent, the young brindle padding at Syl's side because the child had refused to be left behind, and no one had the heart to make her. The whole line moving up the mountain not as sentries, but as what they had been underneath the sentries all along, which was simply a pack of dogs walking their people up a hill. Ash came slowest, at the back, and Wren walked with him, her hand resting on his shoulder, and the old dog climbed to his clearing one more time with the unhurried ease of a thing that no longer had anywhere it had to be. The clearing took the humans the way it had taken the Thren. Otku stood at the edge and watched 11 descendants of the Cassin expedition come out of the trees into the soft silver light and see, for the first time in 300 years, where their people were, the 32 mounds in their 3 careful rows, mossed and settled and kept, each with its stone, and the worn paths between them, and the little cairn in the 3rd row highest of all. He had thought he understood grief. He was a warden. He had buried 100 of his own people. He had said the grief rite over more graves than he could count. He had not understood grief until he watched a human woman named Cassin cross a clearing to a 300-year-old child's grave and go down onto her knees in the moss and put both her hands flat on the settled earth over the bones of a 7-year-old girl who had died before any nation that now existed had been founded, and say, in a wrecked whisper, "Hello, Elu. We found you. We came back. We're so sorry it took so long." The others found their own graves, or graves they chose, since the log could not tell every family which mound held which of the 32, and it did not matter, because a family that has lost track of its dead for 300 years does not quibble over which handful of kept earth to weep on. They knelt among the mounds in the silver light, 11 humans, and, drifting quietly among them, a scatter of Thren who had climbed up behind, and they laid stones, human hands and Thren hands both, adding to the cairns the dogs had built, and Otku understood that he was watching the oldest gesture his own people knew, and the oldest gesture the humans had brought welded together over the same graves. two species who had met 300 years ago in the worst possible circumstances and lost each other, laying stones side by side at last. And the pack lay down at the edge of the clearing and watched, off duty, and let them. Ash walked the rows once. Otku watched him do it, the old gray dog moving slowly down the worn paths between the mounds, the paths his line had worn smooth over 3 centuries of rounds, and he did not stop at them as a guardian stops, testing, holding. He walked them the way an old soldier walks a battlefield decades after, not on watch, just remembering. He stopped once, at the little cairn, at Alu's grave, beside the kneeling woman who carried the child's name, and he lowered his great graying head and stood there a moment. And then he lay down in the moss beside the small grave in the sun, and let the woman put her arm over his shoulders and weep into his coat, and the two of them stayed like that a long while, the last of the line that had guarded the child and the last of the family that had lost her, keeping the small grave together in the afternoon light. They consecrated the ground that season. It was Otku's doing in the end, though he would have said it was Ren's, and Ren would have said it was the 32's. The provincial seat sent an envoy. The human world sent a delegation. The joint liaison network, which had spent 300 years not knowing it had a wound to heal between the two species, discovered that it did and set about healing it with the particular fervor of an institution that has found a good story. The Eastern Massif was declared a shared memorial ground under both human and Thren law, inviolable, tended, open. The first jointly consecrated ground the two peoples had ever made, and it had been made, everyone who told the story afterward agreed, not by diplomats or treaties but by an old dog and a girl with a book. The roll of the 32 was carved in stone and set at the clearing's edge, in human letters and Thren glyphs both, and beneath the 32 names they added a line that Ren wrote and Otku insisted be given equal size. And the guardians of the line who held. They did not rename the wood in the end, though there was talk of it. The quiet wood it had been for 300 years and the quiet wood it stayed, but the word meant something different now when the valley said it. Not the silence of a place that swallowed what entered, but the deep-kept quiet of a place that had been guarded well, the quiet of a cemetery in good order, the quiet of a watch finally, properly, stood down. Marshal Decor's finding held. No reclamation officer ever challenged it. The cedars never came back, and the fire line the crews had cut on the eastern shoulder grew over, that first summer, in a band of new growth greener than the wood around it, a long healing scar that the valley took, without anyone deciding it, to calling the relief. The place where 300 years of fear had turned around in a single morning and run uphill to save the thing it had been afraid of. Otku stayed on as warden, though the job had inverted itself entirely. For 40 years he had stood at the boundary stones to keep his people out of the wood. Now he stood at them to welcome his people in, to guide the children up to the clearing, to teach them the 32 names, to tell them the story of the line that held, to show them how to move quietly among the graves and how to sit still in the moss and let a guardian decide to come to them. He was not a keeper of a taboo anymore. He was a keeper of a memory and a keeper of a wood and a keeper of the peace between two peoples who had found, in the ruin of their first meeting, the beginning of something better. And he thought, most mornings, climbing to the boundary stones in the gray light with the massif standing dark and whole and kept above him, that it was the best 40 years' work he had never known he was doing. The humans went home, most of them, when the consecration was done, back across the 2-month dark to the 3 worlds where the 9 survivors' line had scattered and grown. But they came back, after that, the way people come back to a grave they have finally found, in 1s and 2s, every season, and the Cassin woman came back more than any of them, and always she went first to the clearing, and always the old gray dog met her at the tree line and walked her up, slower each year, and lay beside her in the moss by Alu's small stone while she told the child 300 years of family news. And Ren Halloran stayed. She had come to the Tellen Reach a junior records officer with the loneliest posting in the liaison service, one human alone in a valley that had forgotten humans existed, sorting 3 centuries of unopened crates that nobody thought were worth reading. She was something else now, though nobody had ever formally given it a title. She was the keeper of the wood. She was the one who read to the pack, still, every day, up on the open moss below the tree line. No longer to prove anything, no longer to relieve any post, just because it was the shape of her days, and because an old dog she loved liked the sound of a low, even voice while he slept in the sun. She had, she supposed, the strangest job any human held anywhere. She read aloud, every afternoon, to the descendants of the last soldiers of a war 3 centuries over, in a wood her species had haunted and been saved by, on a world where the fear of 300 years had ended in an old dog laying his head in her lap. She would not have traded it for anything the wider human worlds could have offered her. She had told Decor once, in the letter she wrote back with the marshal's crate of penitent names, that she had spent 4 months alone with 41 dead people, and come out of it with a whole valley and a pack of guardians and a purpose, and that she considered it the best trade anyone had ever made, and she had meant every word. The pup grew up, never having stood a watch. That was the thing Wren found herself thinking about, that first year and the years after. The youngest of the line, born the season before the relief, was the first dog of the Cassin blood in 300 years to reach its full growth without ever once being taught the edge of the ground, and the meaning of the graves, and the long grammar of holding. The old ones did not teach it, because there was nothing to hold any more. It grew up in a wood full of visitors, a wood where children came and sat in the moss, and Thren elders climbed to the clearing to lay stones, and a small human read aloud every afternoon, and it learned, instead of the watch, the things a dog learns in a place at peace, that the children's hands had food in them, that the sun on the clearing's silver moss was the best sun on the mountain, that a low, even human voice reading from an old cracked book meant it was safe to sleep. It was the largest and softest and most useless guardian that line had produced in 3 centuries, and Wren loved it beyond all sense, because it was proof, running joyfully through the trees after nothing at all, that the war was really over. The line had held for 300 years, so that one day a pup could grow up not needing to. Syl grew up too. She was fearless in the way of a child who survived the wood before she was old enough to be told to fear it, and the young brindle guardian that had kept her alive in the root hollow became, without any human arranging it, her shadow and her sworn companion. It walked her to lessons. It lay across the door of her family's home at night. It followed her to the clearing and lay in the moss while she did the thing she had appointed herself to do, which was to visit Alu's grave once a week and tell the 300-year-old girl about being 9, and then 10, and then 11 on the theory, which she explained to Wren with great seriousness, that Alu had never gotten to be older than 7 and somebody ought to tell her what it was like. Wren did not correct the theory. She thought it was the truest thing anyone in the valley had said about the graves, and she noticed that the old dog Ash, who came slower to the clearing every season, always lay near Alu's stone when Syl made her weekly report, as if he too wanted to hear how it came out. Otku said the grief rite over the 32, at last, in the full formal double tone, at the consecration, and again every year on the anniversary of the day the ship had lifted, the day the watch began. He had spent 40 years unable to say it over that ground because his people had not known the ground held graves worth grieving. He made up for it. The whole valley came, every year, up to the clearing, humans and Thren together when the descendants could make the journey, and they said the names, all 32, and then the line Wren had written for the guardians, and then they were quiet a while among the mounds and the stones and the patient old dogs, and it became, over the years, the truest holiday the Tellen Reach kept, not a festival of anything the valley had done, but a keeping of what had been done for them across 300 years, by an animal that asked for nothing and held anyway. And every afternoon, War or no war, holiday or no holiday, Ren Halloran climbed up out of the valley to the open moss below the tree line and sat down in the grass and read aloud. The pack still came to it, most days, drawn by the low, even voice the way their line had been drawn to that voice for 300 years. From the far side of a war none of them alive had ever fought. The pup would sprawl across her feet. The brindle would lie with its chin on its paps and its eyes going slow. And Ash, old Ash, gray now almost to white, moving stiff in the mornings, slow on the climb, but still always, the first to come down out of the trees when he heard her on the slope. Ash would lower himself into the moss beside her with a long groan of contentment, and put his great white head in her lap, the whole heavy trusting weight of it, and sleep in the sun while she read, off duty, relieved. An old dog at the end of a long good life, with nothing left in the world to hold but the hand of the human who had come, at last, to sit with him. She read him everything over the years, the handler's pages first and always, their voices, their names for him, the founding sire he was descended from and named for 300 years back. But other things too when those ran out, the valley's records, the human world's news, the letters from the Cassin descendants, the roll of names decor sent back from each world she returned to. It did not matter what she read. It had never mattered what the handler read 300 years ago, out at the edge of nowhere, only that a person was near and unafraid and speaking low and even, telling the guardian in the oldest way there was that the ground was safe and it could rest. On a gray afternoon late in the old dog's last good autumn, Wren climbed the slope with the cracked leather log under her arm, and Ash came down out of the trees to meet her slower than he had ever come, and she knelt in the moss and put her arms around his broad white neck the way she had wanted to the first day and had not dared, and she held him a while, the old guardian and the human keeper, at the edge of a wood that had been afraid and was not any more. Then she sat, and he lay down and put his head in her lap, and she opened the log to the first page, to the handler's diligent hand, and she read him the line she always came back to in the end, the line that had started all of it, the line an exhausted, grieving woman had written 311 years ago about a great gray dog that would not leave the tree line. Named him Ash for the color of him, she read softly, her hand moving slow on the graying head. Ash it is, good boy. He's decided the trees are the edge of the world and everything behind him is his to keep. The old dog sighed, deep and long, and settled his weight into her lap and slept in the sun. Down in the valley, 300 years of fear were a story the children were told the way children are told any old story, as a thing that had happened to people less wise than themselves, in a darker time, before anyone understood. Up on the massif, the wood stood green and whole and kept. In the clearing, the 32 slept honored under their stones, and a girl who should have been 9 told a girl who never got past 7 what the years were like. And on the open moss below the tree line, in the last good light of an autumn afternoon, a small, ordinary human sat reading aloud to the last soldier of a war 3 centuries over, her hand on his head, his watch finally ended, both of them exactly where they had always, without either of them knowing it, been headed, the human who came back, and the dog who never stopped believing she would. The aliens had feared that would for 300 years. It had taken them all of it to learn what any human could have told them on the first day, if only there had been one there to ask, that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy and the gentlest thing in the galaxy are very often the same animal, lying in the sun with its head in your lap, and the only difference between the two is whether you are the thing it loves or the thing that means harm to what it loves. Wren turned the page and read on, and the old dog slept, and the wood kept its quiet, and the watch was over, and it was enough.